The first warning was not a death, but a sound. A hollow gulp from a public pump in the heart of a Victorian slum, followed by a child collapsing before her cup even touched the ground. Within hours, the alleys reeked of sickness. Water that should have shimmered clear now carried a faint, milky swirl, a sweetness that clung to the tongue like poison disguised as purity. Families lined up for their daily ration, never knowing they were drawing their own graves. And as the pumps wheezed through the night, the disease slipped house to house with the soft confidence of a killer who knew no one could escape. If these forgotten tragedies grip you, if you want more stories of the shadows beneath Victorian Britain, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Your support brings more of history's darkest corners back into the light. Tonight, we follow the water and the plagues that rose with every drop. The sound came just before dawn, long before the slum children stirred beneath their thin blankets. It was not loud, nothing so dramatic as a crack or a gush, but a soft, unsettling gulp, like a throat swallowing something it should not. The old Broadwick pump had stood there for decades, its iron spine leaning slightly as if exhausted by the weight of the neighborhood's thirst. But never once had it produced a sound like that. The few early risers on the street paused, each pretending not to have heard it, yet each feeling the same faint tightening in the chest, as though the pump had whispered a warning directly into their ribs. By the time the first women approached with their dented pails, the morning fog clung low to the cobblestones, wrapping the pump in a pale shroud. Mary Brindle, who lived 3 floors up in a house that smelled perpetually of wet coal, grasped the handle with hands chapped raw from scrubbing floors. The metal felt colder than usual, unnaturally so, as if it had been dipped in winter. When she pushed down, the pump wheezed like a sleeping animal, startled awake, followed by another muted gulp that echoed faintly up the street. Mary frowned but said nothing. Water was water, and silence broke more leases in the slums than sickness ever did. The first stream trickled out slowly, a thin ribbon that caught the weak gaslight in a way she didn't like. It seemed almost thickened. She lifted her bucket closer, convinced her tired eyes were to blame, but the sense of wrongness lingered beneath the surface, swirling just out of sight. When she filled her second bucket, her fingertips brushed the falling water, and she pulled them back with a start. The temperature was curious, warm in places, cold in others, as if 2 separate currents warred within the pump's belly. Behind her, Mrs. Parris shuffled forward with her basin, muttering about the day's washing. "It's groaning again," she whispered, leaning close. "Same as yesterday. I swear that thing ain't right." Mary forced a smile, though her stomach unsettled. "It's old metal, that's all." But in truth, she had dreamt of the pump the night before, of water pooling beneath doorways, of children coughing over bowls of gruel, of something foul climbing the pipes like a shadow with teeth. She had woken convinced it was foolishness, the product of too little sleep and too much worry. Yet standing there now, she could not shake the sensation that the pump was listening. A young boy darted forward with a chipped cup, thrusting it beneath the spout. The pump exhaled another gulp, louder this time, and his cup filled halfway before he dashed off toward the alley. He took 2 eager swallows before disappearing behind a row of crates. The women continued filling their buckets, each more hurried than the last. No one remarked on the strange sweetness that lingered on their tongues afterward, faint but unmistakable, like sugar dissolved into sorrow. As the sun climbed and the slum roused itself to life, the pump's odd noises faded into the usual chorus of clattering dishes and barking vendors. But the hollow gulp had already done its work. It lingered in the ears of those who heard it, a quiet omen threading itself into their morning routines. And far beneath the pump, where broken bricks and rotted timber framed forgotten channels, the water stirred. Something seeped through a thin crack no one had noticed, carrying with it the first whispers of a calamity that would stain the streets with fear. The slum drank deeply from that poisoned heart, unaware that every bucket, every cup, every casual sip was another step toward a disaster already flowing beneath their feet. By noon, 3 households would fall ill. By nightfall, the pump would still stand, shrouded in fog, sighing as though burdened by secrets it could not keep. The sweetness was the first betrayal. Not a pleasant sweetness, nothing like the treacle Mary sometimes bought for the children when coins allowed, but a thin, ghostly flavour that clung to the tongue like a memory one wished to forget. It appeared quietly, almost politely, in the morning water of countless slum households. No one trusted it, yet no one dared discard it either. Water was life in the rookeries, and life rarely afforded the luxury of choice. Mrs. Eliza Harrow noticed it just after dawn. Her room, tucked beneath the sagging roof beams of Brindle Court, had no window large enough to give her proper light, so she relied on the weak glimmer of a candle stub as she boiled a tin kettle for tea. Her husband coughed behind her in the bed, a rattle so deep it sounded as if his lungs scraped against bone, but she ignored him for the moment, focusing instead on the faint scent rising from the kettle. It was sweet. Sweet in a way she had never known water to be. She dipped a spoon, let the liquid trickle back into the pot, and dipped it again, as though repetition might erase doubt. But the sweetness remained, hovering in the steam like a perfumed warning. Her first instinct was to throw it out, to fetch a fresh pail from the pump, but she hesitated. Fetching water meant descending 3 flights of stairs, crossing a muddy courtyard, and waiting among impatient tenants, all while her husband gasped behind her for breath. Besides, what if all the water tasted this way? What if it had always tasted faintly wrong, and she was only now noticing? A soft shuffle came from the corner, where her daughter Annie rubbed her eyes and asked, "Is tea ready, Ma?" Without thinking, Eliza poured the boiling water into the chipped teapot and shook her head at herself. Habit had won. Practicality had won. Fear had no place in a home where survival rested on routine. Annie lifted the cup to her lips. She paused. "It's different today." Eliza forced a laugh. "Everything tastes strange in the morning, sweetheart. Drink up, it'll warm you." But as Annie swallowed, Eliza felt a tightness coil itself around her spine. The girl set the cup down, licking her lips with mild curiosity, unaware that this simple act would lodge itself in her mother's memory like a thorn. Downstairs, the neighbors complained of similar oddities. Broth cooked with the morning water had a syrupy undertone. Tea steeped too quickly. Bread dough refused to rise properly. Mrs. Dalloway, who prided herself on discerning the slightest culinary flaw, declared the water wicked, though she could not explain why. No one believed it could be dangerous, not yet. Water was a fickle companion in London's poorest districts, sometimes murky, sometimes metallic, sometimes tinged with the taste of its own pipes. Sweetness was merely a new quirk. But beneath that sweetness lay something older and far less kind. By midday, the slum children noticed the change as well. They cupped their hands beneath spigots, sipped, wrinkled their noses, and returned to their games in the alleyways. A few spat the water out, insisting it felt thick against their tongues. Others drank greedily, grateful for anything that distracted from the stale air of the rookeries. No one connected the water to the sudden pallor creeping over several neighbors. Not yet. Eliza tried to ignore her unease. She folded laundry, scrubbed the floor, tended to her husband's rattling breath, but every chore felt heavier, as if the sweetness had seeped into the walls themselves. When she finally drank from her own cup, she tasted it again. A softness, a cloying quality, unnaturally smooth. It lingered, refusing to be swallowed fully. That evening, as the slum settled into its familiar chorus of coughing, crying children, and the distant rumble of carts, Eliza returned to the kettle. She swirled the water inside, watching the faintest shimmer cling to the sides. A thought came to her, unwelcome but insistent. Water was not meant to taste sweet. Not here. Not ever. And somewhere beyond the walls of Brindle Court, the pump let out another hollow gulp, as if confirming her fear, as if swallowing a secret she would soon wish she had understood sooner. The first collapse happened on a quiet afternoon, the sort of dim, grey hour when the slums felt suspended between exhaustion and routine. Children played in the narrow stretch of street between Brindle Court and the neighbouring rookery, their laughter sharp against the muffled rattle of carts and the distant moan of factory horns. The air clung damp to the skin, the kind of dampness that made laundry refuse to dry and breath feel heavier in the chest. No one noticed anything amiss until little Thomas Weller stopped running. He paused mid-game, his small hands dropping the wooden button he'd been using as a toy. His face, usually flushed with mischief, drained pale as the fog curling around the gas lamps. One of the older boys shouted at him to hurry up, but Thomas didn't move. His knees trembled, buckled, and he crumpled onto the cobblestones as if sleep had dragged him down by the ankles. For a heartbeat, the alley fell silent. Then came the chorus of startled shrieks. "Fetch his mum!" "Get him up, he's only playing." "No, look at him, look!" Mary Brindle was among the first to reach him, her skirts brushing against the damp stones as she knelt. Thomas lay still, one palm pressed flat against the ground, his breath shallow and rapid. His lips quivered with each exhale, as if the air itself fought him. Mary touched his forehead. It burned beneath her fingers, yet his skin held the clammy chill of fresh sweat. "Eliza!" she called toward a nearby window. "Run for a doctor!" But even as she shouted, Mary's mind drifted unbidden to the pump, to the hollow gulp that morning, to the water that felt too warm, too cold, too wrong. She swallowed hard, pushing the thought aside with the same stubbornness that kept her working through fevers, nights, and heartbreaks. Thoughts could not afford to become fears in the slums, not if one hoped to eat. Thomas's mother, Mrs. Weller, burst into the alley moments later, her apron stained and her eyes wide with dread. She cradled her son, rocking him as though motion alone could pull him back. He stirred only faintly, mumbling something she couldn't understand. His breath came in thin gasps, each weaker than the last. A small crowd formed, neighbours pressing in with whispered theories. Some blamed the cold, others blamed hunger. One muttered that the child must have caught the summer sickness that never quite left. But Mary noticed something. Thomas's lips were tinged with a strange, soft hue, not blue, not grey, but something closer to the pale tone of watered-down milk. A sweet smell drifted from his breath, a sweetness she recognized, a sweetness she had tasted herself. The doctor arrived half an hour later, a young man with a polished bag and a nervous smile that suggested he had more faith in instruments than experience. He examined Thomas with gentle hands, checking pulse, breath, and eyes. Each observation deepened the crease between his brows. "Has he eaten anything strange?" the doctor asked quietly. Mrs. Weller shook her head. "Only tea and bread, same as always." "Has he been drinking enough water?" The question hung in the air like a dropped match. Everyone had been drinking water. Water from the same pump. The doctor hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the street corner where the pump stood, its iron body still damp with the residue of morning fog. He did not speak the suspicion forming in his mind, not yet. But Mary saw it. She saw it in the way his hand stiffened around his bag, in the way his eyes darted toward the slum's narrow drains. They carried more than rainwater these days. As Thomas was carried inside, the children resumed their game with subdued voices, glancing periodically at the doorway. The cobblestones where he had fallen remained damp, though no one could say whether it was from spilled water or sweat. That night, 3 more children fell ill. By dawn, one of them had stopped breathing altogether, and still the pump stood silent save for a faint, rhythmic gulping, as though something deep within its pipes swallowed secrets too heavy for the slum to bear. Dr. Elias Harrow had treated every manner of ailment in the rookeries, coughs that rattled like loose window panes, fevers that burned hotter than forge fires, wounds that festered from the faintest scratch. But nothing unsettled him quite like the cluster of cases arriving within the span of a single day. Children collapsing in the street, adults struck with violent nausea, entire families weakened by some unseen hand. Illness usually crept through the slums like a thief in the night. This one walked boldly, knocking on every door. By late afternoon, Elias found himself standing beside the Broadwick pump, its iron frame slick with condensation. The pump leaned slightly forward, as though listening to the murmurs of the street. Its handle, darkened with years of impatient hands, looked innocent enough. Yet he could not forget the sweetness he had tasted in the water earlier that morning, a sweetness that felt unnatural, cloying, wrong. He pressed his palm against the metal. A faint vibration pulsed beneath, steady and rhythmic, as if the pump bore a heartbeat of its own. Curious, he pushed the handle down. The pump answered with its familiar groan, followed by that odd, hollow gulp he had heard whispered about. A shiver trailed down his spine. "It's been doing that for days," came a voice behind him. Elias turned to see Mary Brindle, her shawl pulled tight against the evening breeze. Her expression carried the quiet dread of a woman who had already seen too much. "You're saying it wasn't always like this?" Elias asked. "No," she replied. "It's worse now. And the water tastes different." Her admission confirmed his fears. He crouched beside the pump, examining the ground where damp patches formed irregular shapes, too dark, too viscous. The cobblestones had a faint sheen that caught the gaslight in a sickly shimmer. He touched the water carefully, letting a drop cling to his fingertip. It felt heavier than water should, as though something unseen weighed it down. Behind them, the slum hummed with its usual dusk chorus, coughing behind thin walls, the clatter of pots, distant arguments rising through poorly mended roofs. But beneath it all lay a tension, the sense that something had shifted underfoot. "I need to see the pipes," Elias murmured. Mary frowned. "The drains? Doctor, you know what's down there?" He did. The underworks of the slums were a labyrinth of forgotten channels, old brick tunnels patched with rotting timber, pipes laid across older pipes, sewage and clean water dancing a dangerous waltz beneath the city. Few dared enter. Fewer returned clean. But the illness spreading through the district was not a random cruelty. It had a source. And Elias felt the same cold determination that had driven him through medical training, long nights in crowded infirmaries, and years tending patients who could offer nothing but gratitude. He found the access grate behind Brindle Court, half buried in muck and broken plaster. The smell rising from it struck him first, a blend of rot, rust, and something faintly sweet, like spoiled fruit left too long in the sun. He lifted the grate with effort, the iron screeching as though protesting his intrusion. A thin mist wafted from below. The darkness beneath the slum pulsed with a damp, living presence. Mary clutched her shawl tighter. "Doctor, are you certain?" "No," Elias admitted. "But if the water is killing us, we must understand how." He descended carefully, boots slipping against moist steps, the lantern in his hand casting a trembling light. The tunnel walls glistened with moisture. Pipes ran along them, some cracked, some patched with tar, others so rusted they resembled skeletal remains. And from one of the largest pipes he heard it again. Gulp. A swallowing noise, faint yet unmistakable. Elias approached. A thin line of liquid seeped through a fracture in the pipe's side, trickling into the channel below. The water shimmered strangely, as if carrying threads of pale smoke within it. He raised the lantern. What he saw made his blood run cold. Sewage from an upper channel had begun leaking directly into the pipe supplying the district's pump. The barrier between filth and drinking water had eroded to a thin, crumbling membrane. Each gulp of the pump drew this tainted mixture upward, sending it straight into the cups, pails, kettles, into the bodies of every family in the slum. Elias staggered back, breath caught in his throat. Above him, the slum remained unaware, lights blinking softly behind curtained windows. Children played, mothers boiled tea. Men returned from factories, dust clinging to their clothes, and all of them drank death with every swallow. He climbed back to the surface, his face pale, his hands trembling. Mary stood waiting, searching his expression for answers. "Well?" she whispered. Elias swallowed hard, tasting once more the sweetness from that morning. "The water," he said, voice heavy as the fog settling over the district, "is poisoning the slum." And somewhere in the distance, the pump answered with another hollow gulp, as if swallowing a secret it could no longer keep. The letter arrived on thick, cream-coloured paper, a luxury so rare in Brindle Court that tenants handled it like a relic. It bore the elegant, looping signature of Mr. Horace Fairchild, proprietor of nearly every dilapidated dwelling in the surrounding slums. His letters always began the same way: "Esteemed tenants," as if politeness alone could plaster over rotting beams or silence the coughs echoing through his buildings. Elias Harrow stood in the cramped entryway of the tenement as Mary read aloud. The tenants gathered around her, lantern light flickering across anxious faces. "Esteemed tenants," she read, "I have received reports of recent illnesses within my properties. After careful review, I assure you the state of the water pump is perfectly safe. Any oddities in taste or appearance are due merely to seasonal changes in the river's composition." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Seasonal changes, as though the river simply woke one morning and decided to kill children. Mary continued, her voice tightening. "There is no evidence to support claims of contamination. I urge tenants to remain calm, avoid unnecessary speculation, and maintain trust in the sanitation measures provided for your well-being." Trust, a word that landed like a stone in mud. Elias clenched his jaw. He had sent a note earlier that day, detailing what he had found in the underworks: the cracked pipe, the seepage, the unmistakable intermingling of filth with drinking water. He had warned that illness would spread faster than fear. He had begged for immediate action. This letter was the answer, a denial wrapped in courtesy. "It doesn't say anything about repairs," Mrs. Weller whispered, clutching her still feverish son against her. Thomas breathed in shallow bursts, each exhale a faint whimper. "No repairs," said Jim Dalloway, shaking his head. "Not even a promise to look at the pipes." "Of course not," muttered a coal-dusted man near the stairs. "Fairchild's pipes have been collapsing for years. Fixing them would cost more than he's willing to part with." Another scoffed. "He doesn't care if we drink from the Thames itself so long as the rent arrives." The lantern hissed as someone adjusted the wick, casting taller shadows along the hallway. Elias stepped forward, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. "Mr. Fairchild is wrong," he said, his voice steady though anger simmered beneath. "The water is contaminated. I saw the breach myself. If we continue drinking from the pump, more will fall ill. Many could die." A collective gasp escaped the crowd. The word "die" was not spoken lightly here. It was a familiar guest, but never a welcome one. "But the pump is all we have," Mary whispered. "Where else are we to get water? The standpipe 2 streets over barely runs. And the Thames," her words trailed off, "the Thames was a graveyard of waste." Elias knew all this. He knew, too, that Fairchild counted on such limitations. Poverty ensured compliance, fear ensured silence, and politeness, the sort woven into every line of the landlord's letter, ensured just enough civility to avoid revolt. A slow knock echoed through the hall. It was Mr. Pell, the building steward, holding a bundle of new notices under his arm. He cleared his throat with theatrical solemnity. "A message from Mr. Fairchild," he announced, posted in all his properties. He unfolded the paper, reading with a puffed chest. "Tampering with the pump or interfering with sanitation equipment will result in immediate eviction and legal consequences. Tenants are reminded that unfounded rumors can incite panic and will not be tolerated." The hallway thickened with outrage. "Unfounded rumors?" barked one man. "Tell that to my daughter," cried a woman near the staircase. "My boy's been sick since yesterday," another growled. Elias felt the crowd shifting, anger brushing against desperation like flint against stone. For a moment, he feared a spark. He raised his hands. "Listen to me. You cannot use the pump. Not another drop. I'll speak with the parish. I'll find a way to bring clean water in, even if it must be carried from afar." "Can you stop Fairchild from throwing us out?" Mary asked quietly. Elias hesitated. The truth tasted bitter. No. Fairchild's power stretched farther than pipes and pumps. His influence wound through courts, inspectors, and constables, all eager to ignore a slum's suffering in exchange for his polite assurances and handsome donations. A soft groan drifted from Mrs. Weller's arms. Thomas trembled, his small fingers curling weakly into her sleeve. The room fell silent. Fairchild's denial had done more harm than the breach itself. It had condemned the slum not just to illness, but to helplessness. Elias folded the landlord's letter, its crisp edges mocking the softness of his own hands, raw from tending to the sick. "Then we must fight the water with every means we have," he said, "because Fairchild will not save us." Outside, the pump released a slow, echoing gulp, as if swallowing another soul. In the slums, laundry was more than a chore, it was a ritual of survival. The women gathered each morning at the long communal basins behind Brindle Court, sleeves rolled, fingers cracked from lie and cold, scrubbing the city's soot from shirts, aprons, and children's stockings. Cleanliness was a kind of dignity here, a fragile defense against sickness and shame. But on this morning, the basin water betrayed them. It began with a shirt. Mrs. Dalloway, who was known for her sharp eye and sharper tongue, plunged her husband's work shirt into the basin and swirled it with practiced efficiency. She scrubbed once, twice, then paused. The suds around her hands had taken on a strange tint, not grey from grime, nor brown from mud, but a faint bluish haze that clung to the fabric like fog trapped in cloth. She lifted the shirt. Instead of rinsing clean, it dripped with streaks of dull colour, as though the water insisted on painting it rather than washing it. "That's odd," she muttered. Mary Brindle, working at the next basin, glanced over. "What's wrong now, Mrs. Dalloway?" "This shirt, it's taking on a colour. Look at it." Mary leaned closer. The shirt glistened with a sheen that shimmered in the pale morning light. It looked almost oily, though the water itself appeared normal, or as normal as slum water ever looked. She dipped her own ragged towel into the basin, rinsed it twice, and watched as the water slid off in thick beads, refusing to leave the cloth entirely clean. A silence spread between the women, each sensing the same creeping unease. "It won't come out," Mary whispered. She rubbed the towel again, harder, but the residue remained, stubborn as mould. "That's the pump's water," declared Mrs. Dalloway, her voice tightening. "I told my Jim it tasted sweet yesterday. Sweet water never meant anything good." Another woman, Mrs. Cotswold, gasped as her basin erupted in frothy bubbles larger and quicker than any soap could produce. The foam climbed over the rim, spilling onto her boots. She stumbled back. What in heaven's name? Elias Harrow arrived just then, drawn by the rising commotion. His eyes scanned the basins, taking in the discoloration, the unnatural foam, the thick, lingering film that coated the laundress's fingers. "Is this all from the same pump?" he asked. "Of course it is," Mrs. Dalloway snapped. "Where else would we get water? Do you think the Thames delivers itself to our doorstep?" The doctor dipped his hand into one basin. A faint warmth pulsed through the water, followed by a slimy weight that clung to his skin even after he withdrew it. He wiped his fingers on a cloth. The sheen remained, refusing to be absorbed. "It's worsening," he murmured. "The contamination is spreading faster than I anticipated." Mrs. Cotswold sank onto a wooden crate, hands trembling. "Doctor, my little one drank from the pump this morning, before we heard your warning." Elias's expression faltered only for a breath before he steadied himself. "Watch for fever, for nausea. If her lips pale or her breath sweetens, fetch me immediately." "Sweetens?" Mrs. Dalloway echoed, offended by the absurdity of the word. "Yes," Elias replied sternly, "a sweetness that doesn't belong to the child." The women exchanged uneasy looks. Laundry was one thing. A child's breath turning sweet was another. A gust of wind lifted scraps of newspaper from the alley, sending them skittering across the ground. Headlines from the wealthier districts fluttered by debates in Parliament, a society wedding, the success of a new play, all so far removed from the slum's reality that they may as well have come from another world. Elias straightened, wiping his brow. "No one is to use this water for washing, cooking, or drinking, not until we find another source." Mrs. Dalloway barked a laugh, brittle as dry twigs. "And where shall we bathe then? In the gutters? Or would you prefer we catch rain in our skirts?" Elias had no answer. The surrounding streets offered no solutions, only more broken pumps, stagnant puddles, and the distant stench of the Thames, swollen with refuse. Behind them, the basins began to bubble again. Slow, steady, unnatural. Mrs. Cotswold screamed. The foam rose not violently, but steadily, with the unsettling confidence of something alive. It spilled over the edges, creeping across the cobblestones in a thin, pale sheet that dissolved into the earth as though sinking back into the city's veins. Mary backed away, breath trembling. "It's coming from below," she whispered. "Whatever's in the pipes. It's rising." Elias stared at the basins, the water within them darkening as though bruised. Death was not simply carried in the water now. It was climbing toward the surface. Inspector Bartholomew Riggs arrived in Brindle Court with the gait of a man who would rather be anywhere else. His boots, polished to a sheen that mocked the mud-slicked cobblestones, sank reluctantly into the grime of the alley as he navigated toward the pump, one hand clutching a leather notebook already swollen with moisture from the morning fog. The notebook was his badge of diligence, though anyone who lived in the slums knew it collected more damp than justice. He paused before the pump, squinting as though evaluating a criminal caught mid-act. The air around it carried a faint metallic sweetness, a scent that felt out of place among the usual stench of refuse and chimney smoke. Riggs wrinkled his nose, flipping open his notebook with exaggerated care. "Complaint number 47, he muttered, tapping the page with a gloved finger. "Water quality concerns, as usual." A cluster of residents had gathered, hovering near enough to witness, but not enough to intrude. Mary Brindle stood among them, arms folded protectively across her chest. She watched as Riggs approached the pump like a man inspecting a stubborn hinge rather than a potential agent of death. He pumped the handle once, a low groan, followed by that now familiar hollow gulp, echoed beneath the metal. The inspector flinched. "That noise again," Mary said sharply. "We've told you about it for days." Riggs sniffed. Pipes shift in old districts. Metal expands. Moisture accumulates. Perfectly ordinary. "It is not ordinary," Mary insisted. "Children collapsed in the street yesterday. My neighbour's laundry won't wash clean. The water tastes." He silenced her with a raised hand. "Miss, please. Hysteria solves nothing." Hysteria. The word clattered against the stone like something hard and dismissive. Mary bit back her retort. Mothers were burying infants, and the man called it hysteria. Riggs knelt beside the pump, dipping a small vial beneath the spout. The water flowed reluctantly, its texture just thick enough to catch the light in an unsettling way. He held the vial up to his eye. The liquid shimmered faintly, a cloudiness shifting within it like smoke trapped under water. He murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. Dr. Harrow found contamination in the pipes, Mary said. Sewage, leaking into the supply. He saw it with his own eyes. Riggs scribbled something vague in his notebook. Dr. Harrow is enthusiastic. His findings are under review. Under review? Mary repeated, incredulous. People are dying. Riggs did not meet her gaze. His attention drifted toward the street where Mr. Fairchild's steward, stiff-backed Mr. Pell, stood watching, arms crossed, expression carved from polished stone. The inspector cleared his throat. Water irregularities can arise from many factors: sediment from river shifts, seasonal impurities, minor chemical seepage, nothing to suggest widespread danger. A cold ripple passed through the gathered crowd. Riggs's words were the sort spoken in newspaper offices and drawing rooms, phrases designed to smooth panic into obedience. Mrs. Weller stepped forward, voice trembling with exhaustion. "Look at my son." She held Thomas in her arms, his head limp against her shoulder. His skin glistened with sweat that cooled too quickly on his brow. "Does this look like seasonal impurity?" Riggs hesitated, the mask of indifference slipping for the briefest moment. He leaned in, touching Thomas's forehead with the back of his glove. The boy let out a faint, delirious moan, his breath carrying the unsettling sweetness Elias Harrow had warned of. The inspector recoiled before he could stop himself. He recovered quickly. Too quickly. "I will include this in my report," he said, voice thinner now. "Further investigation may be conducted if deemed necessary." "If deemed necessary?" Mary's voice cracked like splintering wood. "How many must fall sick before that?" Riggs snapped his notebook shut. "I have procedures to follow. Your concerns are noted. But spreading fear is—" A sudden bubble rose from the pump's spout, bursting with a soft plop that sent a pearly residue dripping onto the stones. The inspector stared at it, at the unnatural sheen, the viscous slide, and for a moment, fear flickered across his features. Just as quickly, it vanished. "Likely mineral build-up," he declared, stepping back as though the pump might lunge at him. He tipped his hat, turned sharply on his heel, and strode away, notebook tucked beneath his arm. The residents watched him disappear through the fog-heavy street, his silhouette swallowed by the city that no longer cared to look beneath its own surface. Only when he was gone did Mary speak. "He's afraid," she whispered. Elias Harrow, emerging from the alley with his sleeves rolled and his lantern dim, nodded grimly. "Yes," he said, "but fear in the wrong man is useless." The pump exhaled another hollow gulp, as if mocking the inspector's retreat, swallowing the truth just as efficiently as the city swallowed the suffering of its poorest. And the slum, still drinking from its poisoned heart, braced for the next wave of illness, already rising beneath their feet. The smell arrived before the bodies did faint at first, a whisper of metal threading through the damp morning air. Brindle Court had always carried unpleasant scents, coal dust drifting from factory stacks, stagnant puddles souring in the gutters, food scraps fermenting beneath broken crates. But this was different. This was sharp, clean in a way that felt unclean, a cold tang that clung to the nostrils like the breath of a butchered animal. Mary Brindle noticed it the moment she stepped outside to shake crumbs from her apron. The fog hovered low, hugging the alley walls in a pale, indifferent embrace. She inhaled, expecting the usual morning odors, but instead her senses met something unmistakable. Iron. Not the scent of tools or nails or fresh-cut rails. No, this was the smell of blood. She froze, her breath catching. There were no wounded men in sight, no slaughtered livestock, no obvious reason for the copper scent saturating the air. Yet it lingered, heavy and insistent, as though carried upward from the ground itself. A shutter creaked open above her. Mrs. Dalloway leaned out, pinning a rag to the sill. "You smell it too?" she called down. Mary nodded, uneasy. "It's like the alley's bleeding." Mrs. Dalloway clicked her tongue. "This place has bled for years, dear. Only now we can smell it." More residents emerged, each reacting in their own way, frowns forming, shoulders stiffening, hands instinctively covering noses. Even the children paused their early play, sniffing the air with wrinkled faces. Elias Harrow soon appeared, his medical bag slung over one shoulder, his eyes already scanning for cause. He inhaled deeply, lips pressing into a thin line. "The smell isn't from above ground," he said quietly. "It's coming from the drains." A collective shudder rippled through the group. Drains were feared in the slum's dark, unknowable channels where waste, sickness, and secrets flowed freely. Anyone who had ever peered into those black mouths knew they swallowed more than refuse. "What do you mean?" Mary asked. Elias crouched beside a grate embedded in the cobblestones. The iron bars were slick with moisture. When he lifted his lantern, the flickering light revealed a slow trickle beneath water, tinged with a reddish hue, swirling in sluggish patterns as though reluctant to move on. Mrs. Weller gasped. "Is that blood?" "No," Elias said softly. "But the contamination is worsening. Whatever the water is passing through, it's leaching minerals, rust, filth, mixing into something that mimics the scent of iron." He hesitated. "And perhaps something worse." Mary's stomach twisted. "Worse than sewage leaking into the drinking water?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He stared into the grate, lost in thought, as though listening to something beneath the city's surface. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled with restraint. "The fever cases are increasing. Not just sickness delirium, hallucinations, muscles convulsing as though charged by invisible currents." He swallowed. "This smell. It means the contamination is spreading through the underworks faster than we feared." A thin cry pierced the morning fog. Everyone turned. At the far end of the alley, beside the leaning wall of Harrigan's abandoned workshop, a young woman staggered into view. Her dress clung to her body, damp with sweat. Her eyes, wide, shimmering, unfocused, darted between the faces watching her. "It burns," she whispered, clutching her throat. "The water burns." She collapsed. Mary rushed to her side, kneeling on the cold stone. The scent of iron thickened around them. When Elias checked the woman's pulse, his fingers touched skin so cold it bordered on lifeless. Her breath carried the same sweetness that now haunted every sick room in the slums. "Help me lift her," Elias said. They carried the woman inside, leaving the alley momentarily quiet, but the iron smell remained, coiling in the air, clinging to walls, seeping into clothing, a scent that felt like warning, like omen, like the breath of something rising through the city's veins. By noon, more residents reported the same metallic tang drifting through side streets and courtyards. By dusk, the smell reached even those who had pretended not to notice, those who insisted nothing was wrong. By nightfall, one chilling truth had settled over Brindle Court. The water was no longer hiding its corruption. It was announcing it. The fever came quietly at first, slipping through the rookery like a draught beneath a crooked doorframe. It began with murmurs: a child too warm, a father shivering in his sleep, a neighbor claiming she felt strange in the bones. In the slums, fever was no stranger, but this one had a different temperament. It did not creep, it gathered. It did not burn, it seethed. It rose like a tide, slow but unstoppable, until every room in Brindle Court seemed to breathe with its heat. Mary Brindle awoke before dawn to the sound of coughing, deep, wet, and rhythmic, as though someone were wringing water from their lungs. The walls of her room were thin, their slats warped by decades of damp, and the noise carried easily. It was Mrs. Weller in the next room, struggling again. Mary pressed her ear to the plaster. The coughing grew louder, more frantic, and then suddenly broke off into a ragged silence. She dressed quickly and stepped into the hallway. The air was heavy, warm, moist, and tinged with the now familiar sweetness that turned her stomach. By the time she reached the Wellers' door, Elias Harrow had already arrived, lantern in hand, his expression grim. Thomas lay on the bed, flushed deep crimson, his hair plastered to his forehead. His breaths came in shallow, rapid bursts. Mrs. Weller knelt beside him, wringing a cold cloth until water spilled onto the floorboards. "He's burning up," she whispered, voice frayed. "I've never seen heat like this." Elias touched the boy's wrist gently. His pulse is racing. He reached for his medical bag, pulling out a vial of tincture. "We must cool him, and you must keep him awake as much as possible." Mary stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the boy's face. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment he whispered something unintelligible, something that sounded like the water. Mary felt a cold shiver slide down her spine. The fever did not spare the adults either. Across the courtyard, Mrs. Dalloway lay sprawled on her parlour couch, muttering fever dreams beneath her breath. Her husband, usually a sturdy man hardened by years in the factories, leaned over her helplessly, trying to wipe away sweat that reformed as quickly as he removed it. The sheets beneath her bore the scent of iron and something else, something sour and faintly sweet, like fruit left to rot in the sun. In another unit, a pregnant woman clutched her swollen belly as chills racked her body. Her midwife lit candles and whispered prayers, though both women knew the fever did not answer to prayer. Nor did it stop at any threshold. It seeped beneath doors, climbed staircases, infiltrated basements and attics alike. By mid-morning, the rookery pulsed with illness. Elias moved from door to door, his lantern swinging through narrow corridors like a restless star. He checked pulses, cooled brows, whispered instructions, but with each patient he saw, a deeper unease settled into his chest. This was no ordinary contagion. He had treated cholera, influenza, typhus, but none of them moved with such consistency, such uniformity. The symptoms appeared in clusters, rising swiftly after exposure, as if the sickness had a clockwork precision. And always, always, there was the sweetness, on the breath, on the skin, in the sweat that soaked the bedding. Mary followed Elias through the halls, helping where she could, fetching water from safer sources, lifting blankets, comforting children. But every time she caught that cloying scent, she fought the urge to gag. It was the scent of sickness, of corruption, of something unnatural working its way through the bloodstream. As the sun dipped behind the smoke-stained rooftops, the rookery dimmed. Lamps flickered weakly against the gathering gloom. The fever had not yet peaked. Mary could feel it in the heat vibrating through the building's wooden bones. In the courtyard below, someone began to cry. It was a wail Mary recognized too well, the sharp, keening sound of a mother losing her child. She closed her eyes. The fever had claimed its first victim of the day, but it would not be its last. Elias stood in the doorway beside her, his hand tightening around the lantern's handle. Its light trembled across the hallway walls. "The water has turned the rookery into a furnace," he whispered, and as if answering him, the pump across the courtyard exhaled a hollow, echoing gulp, sending that dreadful sweetness drifting once more through the air. Night in the rookery usually arrived without ceremony, a slow dimming, a quiet resignation, the familiar settling of bodies exhausted by another day's survival. But on this night, darkness descended like a curtain pulled too quickly, silencing even the usual arguments, the shouts from taverns, the restless steps of factory men returning home. Something unspoken coiled in the air, something heavy enough to hush the slums into a single, trembling breath. It began with a sound, or rather, the absence of one. For weeks, the Broadwick pump had groaned and gulped and sighed through the slums every waking hour. Those sounds, unsettling as they were, had become a kind of grim companion, a reminder that water tainted, dangerous, but necessary, still flowed through the veins of the district. Even at midnight, the pump whispered in the distance, a metal lullaby that threaded through cracked windows and broken shutters. But tonight, Mary Brindle awoke to silence. She sat up, heart thudding, listening. Nothing, no groan, no drip, no hollow intake of breath. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still, as though waiting for her next move. She reached for her shawl and crept through the dim hallway. Below, the tenement's stairwell glowed faintly from a single lantern left burning near the entrance. A few neighbors lingered on the landing, whispering nervously. "It's gone quiet," someone murmured. "Hasn't made a sound in over an hour. Lord help us, what if it stopped?" Mary descended the stairs, her feet barely making a sound. She pushed open the front door and stepped into the courtyard. Fog draped itself across the buildings like wet linen. The pump stood in the center, its metal frame slick with condensation that glimmered in the moonlight. It looked smaller somehow, diminished, without its usual symphony of complaint. A figure knelt beside it. Elias Harrow. His lantern illuminated the pump's handle, which hung motionless like a dead limb. Elias touched the metal gently, as though checking for a pulse. His fingers lingered. Then he shook his head. "It's dry," he said quietly. "Completely dry." Mary's breath caught. "Dry? But how?" "It's never." "It has," Elias replied, "but never for long. This is different." He stood, wiping his hands on his coat. His expression was grave, yet there was something else beneath it, sorrow, perhaps, or fear. "If the pump has run dry," he said, "it means the breach in the pipes has worsened. The contamination may have overwhelmed the supply. The mechanism might have jammed or collapsed entirely." Mary stepped closer, laying a hand on the pump's cold surface. The silence beneath her palm was unnerving. She had never realized how much life she attributed to the pump's mutterings until they vanished. "So we have no water," she whispered. "None that is safe," Elias answered. "And now, none at all." A door creaked behind them. Mrs. Dalloway emerged, her shawl pulled tight. "My Jim went to fetch water an hour ago," she said. "He came back with nothing but an empty pail and panic on his face. He said the pump made a sound like it was choking. Then it stopped. Choking. The word slithered into Mary's mind like a warning. "Can it be fixed?" she asked. Elias hesitated. "Perhaps, but it will require opening the lower pipes." He glanced toward the grate in the alley, and descending into the underworks again in their current state would be dangerous. A soft moan drifted from a nearby doorway. The fever had not rested. It prowled through the rookery even now, claiming breath after breath. Mary imagined mothers waking to dry buckets and burning foreheads, to children gasping for water that no longer came. "What will we drink?" Mrs. Dalloway whispered. "What will we cook with? Wash with? The basin water's already fouled. The other pump in Mulberry Lane went out last week." Elias looked toward the darkened rooftops, as though searching for an answer beyond human reach. "The parish may send barrels," he said softly, "or the city may respond. But by the time help arrives—" He let the remainder of his sentence dissolve into the fog. Mary understood. Help was never swift for people like them. A sudden creak echoed from beneath the pump. Everyone froze. The metal shifted slightly, not with life, but with strain. A single droplet of water fell from the spout, landing on the cobblestone with a delicate tap. It spread slowly outward, forming a small, pale puddle. Mrs. Dalloway gasped. "Look at it!" The droplet shimmered with that same sickly sheen, blue-grey, faintly milky, the color of corrupted life. Elias knelt again, studying the tiny puddle with grim intensity. "The contamination is pushing upward," he whispered. "Even without pressure, it rises." Mary stepped back, heart pounding. The fever was no longer confined to bodies. The sickness was climbing through the city's veins, seeking new ways to breach the surface. And the pump, silent now, but not harmless, seemed to crouch in the moonlight like a beast preparing for its final breath. Night held its silence. The rookery waited, and somewhere deep below, the water continued to move. Dawn crept into Brindle Court like a reluctant messenger, its pale light slipping between chimney stacks and fractured window panes. It illuminated scenes of quiet misery, fevered children tossing on thin mattresses, mothers pacing with half-filled cups of water they dared not use, the pump standing mute and useless in the courtyard. But the place where the morning's sorrow truly gathered was the communal basin behind the tenement, where Mrs. Ada Merrin, newly widowed, knelt in silence. Her husband, Samuel, had died only hours earlier. No doctor had been called. No neighbor had been summoned. His passing had been swift, a sudden collapse upon their shared cot, followed by a sweetness on his breath that Ada once mistook for the scent of apples. That sweetness lingered even now, clinging to her skin, to her memory, to the thin veil of steam rising from the kettle she had boiled in vain. She carried his shirt, the one he'd worn at the factory the day before, to the basin with slow, mechanical steps. The fabric felt heavier than cloth should feel, as though it had absorbed the weight of his final breath. Her fingers trembled as she lowered the garment into the basin's still surface. The water did not receive it kindly. Instead of sinking, the shirt floated just beneath the surface, buoyed by pockets of air trapped in its folds. When Ada pressed it down with both hands, delicate rings of pale foam formed beneath her palms, drifting outward in fragile circles. She froze. It was the same foam she had seen on Samuel's lips. Footsteps approached behind her. Mary Brindle, carrying her own bundle of washing, stopped short at the sight of Ada's rigid posture. "Ada, you shouldn't be out here," Mary said gently. "Not today. Not after." Ada shook her head. Speaking felt impossible. Grief had stiffened her throat to iron. Mary knelt beside her, eyes softening when they caught the strange sheen on the basin water. "Has it worsened?" Ada dipped her fingers into the water, watching the foam cling stubbornly to her skin. When she spoke, her voice scraped like stone. "This is what Samuel breathed, Mary. This is what killed him." Mary exhaled shakily. "Elias said the fever would rise quickly. But none of us thought—" "No," Ada interrupted, her voice gaining its first trace of fire. "The fever didn't kill him. The water did. This water." She gripped the shirt tighter, twisting it until drops splattered onto the cobblestones. The droplets shimmered with that now familiar milky tint, as though carrying ghosts of the things they touched. Behind them, other women arrived, Mrs. Cotswold clutching a basket, Mrs. Dalloway muttering darkly about the state of her wash. One by one, they froze, staring at the widow bowed over the basin. "Lord preserve us," Mrs. Cotswold whispered. "It's spreading through everything." Mary nodded grimly. "Clothes, cookpots, bath water, even the basins. There's no safe corner left." A distant cough echoed from one of the upper windows. Another answered from across the courtyard. The rookery itself seemed to wheeze, its old timbers groaning beneath the weight of suffering. Elias Harrow arrived moments later, lantern in hand, despite the daylight. His face was drawn, sleepless. When he approached the basin, he inhaled sharply. "It's stronger here," he murmured. "The contamination, it's concentrated. The basin must be fed by a secondary pipe connected to the pump." Ada looked up at him, eyes hollow. "Samuel washed his hands here yesterday. He said the water felt strange. He laughed about it." Her gaze drifted downward. That was the last thing he ever laughed at. The doctor swallowed, his jaw tightening. "The water is poisoning quickly now. It's no longer diluted. It gathers in pockets beneath the buildings, rising wherever pressure allows." "Like rot crawling upward through wood," Mary whispered. "Exactly like that," Elias said. They stood around the basin, watching the foam thicken. It bubbled softly, as though the water itself breathed shallow, irregular, wrong. Ada lifted Samuel's shirt from the basin, wringing it out with trembling arms. The fabric sagged, saturated with more than water, saturated with the truth no one wanted to face. "I want to bury him clean," she whispered, "but the water won't let me." Mary touched her shoulder gently. "We'll help you, with whatever clean water we have left." Elias closed his eyes briefly. "Clean water," he echoed. "Yes, for as long as we can find it." But even he knew the truth. Clean water in the rookery was fading, draining away like hope through a cracked pipe. And as Ada Merrin carried her husband's damp shirt back toward the tenement, the basin behind her released one soft, sorrowful gulp, as though mourning another life it had stolen. The first letter arrived at dusk, its edges damp from the fog that curled through every crack of the rookery. It was slipped beneath Dr. Elias Harrow's door with no knock, no greeting, only the faintest rustle, as if delivered by a trembling hand that feared being seen. Elias found it while preparing another round of poultices for the fevered children upstairs. The envelope, thin and wrinkled, bore no name. Just a reddish stain on the corner, as though someone had gripped it too tightly. He broke the seal. "Doctor, something is happening in Bramble Court. 3 are dead. 1 went mad before he passed. Their water tasted sweet. Please come, but come quickly, before the others fall." There was no signature, only a shaky line at the bottom, as if the writer's hand had faltered before finishing. Elias's pulse quickened. Bramble Court lay 2 streets away, close enough that their wells and pipes might share the same poisoned network. He had suspected the contamination would spread, but not so swiftly, not with such ferocity. He folded the letter, tucking it into his coat just as another knock sounded, this one sharp, urgent. Mary Brindle entered without waiting. Her face was pale, her shawl thrown hastily around her shoulders. "Elias," she said, breathless, "another letter just arrived at Mrs. Dalloway's. From someone in Narrow Street. They're begging for a doctor." She held out a second envelope. Its ink had run, black tears streaking across the page. "Children convulsing. Waterfowl. Fever climbs the walls. We cannot stop it." Elias felt the weight of both letters in his hands, 2 voices from 2 different slums, each crying out in the same fear-laced script. He knew what they meant. The disease was no longer isolated. The tainted water had seeped into the arteries of the city, moving unseen through intersecting pipes and neglected conduits. It carried sickness the way blood carried life, steady, unstoppable. "Word travels faster than cure," Elias murmured. "By morning, there will be more." He spoke quietly, but Mary heard the dread beneath his tone. Outside, the hallway shifted with activity. Mothers called to neighbors. Men coughed behind closed doors. A baby wailed, its cry thin and exhausted. The rookery had become a hive of whispers and fevered footsteps. Another knock, a third letter. This one arrived by courier, a skinny boy with soot-stained cheeks. He thrust the envelope into Elias's hands before darting away like a sparrow fleeing a storm. The handwriting inside was finer, steadier, the script of a physician. "Harrow, reports from Whitefriar Lane match your findings. Sweetened breath, iron-scented sweat, rapid decline. I fear this may become epidemic if the source is not isolated. Have you learned more? Respond quickly. The board must be informed, though many doubt your claims. We need proof. We need certainty." Elias exhaled slowly. Even fellow doctors were now writing to him in secret, bypassing official channels. Fear made allies of unlikely men. Mary stepped closer, gripping his arm. "You must answer him." "I will," Elias said. "But I need more than words. I need evidence that even Fairchild cannot deny." He reached for his lantern. Mary stiffened. "You're not going back into the underworks tonight, are you?" "Elias, the pipes." "I must," he replied. "If the contamination has reached Bramble Court, Narrow Street, Whitefriar Lane, Then it may already be weaving itself beneath half of Suffolk. Mary swallowed hard. Then I'm coming with you. He turned sharply. No, it's too dangerous. So is staying here, she whispered. We're surrounded by the same poison, yet somewhere in those tunnels is the truth that may save us or bury us. You won't face it alone. Her words trembled, but her gaze did not. Elias hesitated, then nodded. Before they left, he gathered the letters, binding them with twine. As he tucked them into his coat pocket, he realized how heavy they felt, though they weighed almost nothing. Each envelope carried more than ink. Each held a fragment of the fear now gripping the city. Fear written in shaking hands. Fear sealed with urgency. Fear delivered by strangers because their voices had been silenced in every other quarter. As Elias and Mary stepped out into the fog-drenched night, a cold wind swept through the courtyard, rattling shutters and stirring debris along the stones. Another letter arrived just as the door swung shut behind them. This one would remain unopened until morning, by which time the person who wrote it would already be dead. The clouding happened overnight quietly, without spectacle, the way rot slips beneath a floorboard or mold takes root in a damp corner. By dawn, the water in Hollow Bend had transformed. What once trickled clear, or at least tolerably dull, now emerged from kettles and pitchers with a murky pallor, like breath, trapped inside glass. It was not opaque enough to be called dirty, nor translucent enough to be called clean. It hovered in an uncanny in-between, a ghost suspended in liquid. Old Mrs. Whitcomb was the first to speak of it. She came hobbling into the alley with her tin mug, sloshing its contents toward the early risers gathered around the communal fire barrel. "Look at it," she rasped. "Look at what they've given us to drink." The men and women leaned in. The water shimmered strangely, a pale haze swirling through it, dissolving and reforming like drifting smoke. When the mug tilted, the haze clung briefly to the rim before sliding downward in slow ribbons. Mary Brindle felt a coldness stir in her stomach. The sweetness, the foam, the iron scent, each had been a warning. But this clouding was different. It was visible, unmistakable, a corruption so bold it no longer bothered to hide. Thomas Weller's mother approached, carrying a bowl from which steam rose reluctantly. She set it on a crate, revealing broth meant for her ailing son. The liquid was tinted the same eerie color. "It wasn't like this last night," she whispered. "It was plain as water ever gets here. But by morning—" She clasped her hands tightly, knuckles pale. "How am I supposed to feed him this?" "Don't," came a voice behind her. Elias Harrow stepped through the alley's dim fog, his coat still dusted with the grit of the underworks. He had aged 10 years in one sleepless night. His eyes carried the weight of pipes collapsing somewhere in the city's gut, of letters warning of outbreaks spreading block by block, and of the cries that rose from fevered rooms he could not be everywhere to treat. He took the mug from Mrs. Whitcomb. For a long moment he stared at the clouded water, watching the pale formations shift like dying embers. "It's heavier now," he murmured. "The contamination is thickening. The water is carrying something suspended, something that does not belong." He dipped a fingertip into the liquid. When he withdrew it, a faint residue clung to the skin, shimmering under the muted morning light. A hush fell over the alley. Mrs. Dalloway, who always carried herself with a sharp certainty, now looked more like a child lost in an unfamiliar room. "Is it sewage?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Elias said softly. "Not only sewage. There are minerals dissolving rust from collapsed pipes, sediment forced through ruptured walls, and," his voice tightened, "microbes thriving in the mixture. Too many. Far too many." A man near the fire barrel cursed under his breath. "We'll all be dead before the city officials lift a finger." Mary turned toward Elias. "What does this mean, truly?" He sighed, not heavily, but with a quiet resignation that sent a shiver through the gathered crowd. "It means the poison in our water has reached a tipping point," he said. "Where once it lurked hidden in taste and scent, it now reveals itself plainly. The underworks are failing faster than we can comprehend. The pipes that should keep waste separate from supply have split wide enough that the water no longer pretends to be clean." A mother in the crowd clutched her small daughter closer. But what are we to drink?" Elias avoided her eyes. In the silence that followed, the pump across the courtyard released a soft sputter, not a gulp this time, a straining, stuttering cough, as though choking on the very water it was meant to provide. From inside the houses, coughing echoed, men, women, children punctuating the still air like distant tolls of a funeral bell. As Mary listened, she realized the alley itself sounded feverish. Windows rattled with restless breathing. Floorboards creaked under bodies too weak to rise. The slum had become a single, shared organism, sick to its foundations. A pot overturned in the distance, spilling more clouded water across the stones. It spread slowly, pooling into a reflective puddle. The silvery haze within it pulsed gently, like a living thing adjusting to its new surface. Ada Merrin, the widow, stepped forward silently. She stared at the puddle with an expression too broken for tears. "It looks like breath," she whispered, "trapped in the water, as if the city itself is breathing sickness into us." Elias closed his eyes. And for the first time since the outbreak began, Mary saw something in him that terrified her more than any symptom, more than any residue or foam. He had no immediate plan, no remedy, no next step. The water had turned clouded thick with corruption, bold in its warning. And the rookery, with nowhere left to turn, braced for the next cruelty rising beneath the cobblestones. The apothecary on Wren Street had once been a refuge, a narrow shop fragrant with lavender satchels, camphor jars, and the dusty sweetness of dried elderflower. Its windows, fogged by years of coal smoke, glowed warmly at night, guiding the sick and anxious toward its familiar wooden door. But now, as the slum's illness deepened, the shop had become something else entirely, a place of desperation. Mary Brindle felt the change the moment she stepped inside. The bell above the door rang, but its cheerful chime sounded hollow, swallowed swiftly by the heavy air. Shelves that once held neat rows of tinctures and tonics were pocked with emptiness, like missing teeth in an aging smile. And behind the counter stood Mr. Olcott, the apothecary, a thin man whose spectacles clung crookedly to his face, and whose hands trembled slightly as he sorted through bottles that were no longer full. He looked up with a weary sigh. "Miss Brindle," he said, voice hoarse from nights without rest, "if you're here for more fever root or laudanum, I fear I've nothing left strong enough to matter." Mary tightened her shawl. "Anything will help. The children." Her voice faltered. "Thomas Weller is nearly gone. Mrs. Merrin can barely stand. And now Mrs. Dalloway's husband is burning with fever as well." Mr. Alcott rubbed his forehead. "I know. Every street has sent someone. They queue outside at dawn, and by evening I've nothing left but empty jars and prayers." He gestured toward a shelf once filled with blue glass bottles. Only two remained. One held a sliver of crushed mint leaves, the other was completely empty, save for residue clinging to its base like the ghost of something once potent. "What about willow bark?" Mary asked. "Ginger? Chamomile?" "Gone," he said. "All gone. Even the useless remedies have been taken pennywort, dried moss, rose hips, chalk powders, anything that might give comfort for a moment." A knock sounded sharply behind them. The door creaked open, admitting a blast of cold air and the gaunt figure of Agnes Cotswold. "Mr. Olcott," she gasped. "My youngest can't breathe. His lips have turned pale as ash. Please, something, anything." The apothecary's face twisted with helplessness. "Mrs. Cotswold, if I had anything left, I would give it. I swear it." She staggered forward, gripping the counter. eyes shining with terror. I boiled the water twice. I strained it through cloth. It still tasted sweet. He still fell ill. Mary reached for Agnes's arm, guiding her gently toward a chair. Agnes collapsed into it, her sobs muffled by her sleeve. Mr. Alcott swallowed hard. This isn't fever as we know it. It's something carried, spread through every cup, every pot, every wash basin. He paused. And whatever it is, it grows stronger by the hour. He moved toward the back room, beckoning Mary to follow. Inside, crates lay open, their contents stripped bare. Papers littered the table, letters from suppliers refusing delivery to slum districts for fear of contagion. A few bottles remained, but when Alcott lifted them to the light, Mary saw only dregs clinging to the glass. "I sent for more quinine," he whispered, but the reply I received said, "The docks are refusing to unload shipments coming from river-adjacent warehouses. They fear the contamination may have spread to their casks." Mary's breath caught. "Even the docks?" "Yes," he lowered his head. "Word spreads quickly when death moves with this kind of certainty." A faint rattling drifted from the street, coughing, deep and desperate. A child's cry followed, thin and wavering. The sounds pressed against the apothecary's thin walls, filling the shop with the echo of suffering. Mary stepped back into the front room. Agnes had quieted, but her eyes were distant, as though she were already grieving a child not yet gone. Outside the shop window, fog drifted like pale smoke, carrying within it the distant outlines of neighbors moving slowly through the street as if wading through grief itself. Mr. Alcott emerged carrying a small paper packet. "Take this," he said softly to Agnes. "It's only dried mint and a pinch of elderflower. It won't cure, but it may soothe him. A little." Agnes clutched it to her chest as though it were gold. When she left, Mary turned to the apothecary. "This can't continue," she whispered. "They're dying, and the shelves are bare," he finished quietly. "And when the shelves go bare in a slum, Miss Brindle, something else begins to fill them." Mary frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked toward the doorway, as if expecting someone to appear. "Fear," he murmured. "Fear fills the shelves next. And after fear comes anger." A gust of wind swept through the street, rattling the shop windows. Outside, the pump in Brindle Court remained silent, but the sickness it had spilled into the city echoed in every cough, every plea, every empty shelf. And Mary Brindle realized, with a chill deeper than fever, that they were no longer fighting just water. They were fighting despair itself. The novelty of illness had a way of creeping into the slums, cloaked in curiosity before it revealed its true face of terror. It arrived quietly at first, whispered along alleyways, carried in the half-suspicious glances of children as they clutched tin cups of water from the tepid, sweetened pumps. Even in Brindle Court, where the odor of iron and mildew had become an almost natural part of life, the residents sensed something new this morning, a subtle tension that threaded itself through the air, curling into every doorway, clinging to every ragged sleeve and sallow face. It was a novelty of dread, the strange fascination that always precedes recognition of danger. Elias Harrow moved between the houses with deliberate care, his lantern casting long, jittering shadows against the walls that reeked of coal and damp. He stopped in one doorway, leaning to examine the small girl on the floor. Her hands flailed weakly in the air, as if pushing away the invisible force that pressed upon her chest. Her mother's apron had become a makeshift towel pressed to the girl's brow, but the dampness of fever had soaked it through. Elias pressed his gloved fingers to her neck, counting the pulse that raced like a frantic drumbeat in the still room. "She's taken it faster than the others," he murmured to Mary Brindle, who stood behind him, her shawl wrapped tight against the chill. "This one's the first to succumb to the novelty of it all. The pattern of its spread is alarming." Mary's lips pressed together, her eyes following the lantern light as it danced over the other children in the room. "It spreads through the water, through the very fabric of their lives," she whispered. "And still, people drink it, unaware. Still, they touch it, bathe in it, and scrub their laundry in it." Elias looked toward the basin where the water sloshed lazily, its murky swirl catching the dim light. He could see the foam rising faintly, the residue clinging stubbornly to the sides as though protesting against the intrusion of his hands. "It has become something more than mere disease," he said. "It has a rhythm, a cunning that fools the senses. One sip, and the body succumbs slowly, fascinated by the sweetness, the unfamiliar taste of it. This novelty deceives, disarms, and destroys in equal measure." Outside, the alleyways murmured with activity. Mothers carried their children, huddled close, while men peered from doorways at the distant pump, hesitant to approach yet compelled by necessity. Even the street cats, pale and scruffy, circled the barrels of water with wary curiosity, sniffing at what humans ignored. The air was thick with the tang of iron and decay, a chemical undertone that clung to clothing and hair alike, seeping through the cracks of houses like smoke from a fire that had long since consumed its fuel. A sudden cough echoed from the top floor of the nearest tenement. Another child's cry followed. Elias straightened, taking in the scene with grim understanding. "The novelty of it has begun to take hold," he said quietly. "What began as curiosity, a strange taste, a faint sweetness, a harmless-looking foam now moves through every street, every house, every body, and soon it will leave nothing untouched." Mary's eyes were fixed on the floor, where a small puddle reflected the weak morning light, murky and unwelcoming. "And yet," people continue, she said, "they are drawn to it as though it were a treat rather than a weapon." Elias's jaw tightened. "Curiosity kills more than the cat here," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying over the soft, uneasy murmurs of the slum. "It kills the children first, then the mothers, then the fathers, and all of it disguised as novelty." The lantern swung in his hand, illuminating the small faces twisted with fever, fascination, and fear. Outside, the pump released a hollow, hesitant gulp, echoing across the courtyard, a reminder that the menace had not paused, that the novelty of illness was only beginning to claim its dominion. Here, in the heart of the rookery, the residents would soon learn that fascination could be as lethal as fever, that curiosity, sweetened and murky, might be the very first herald of death itself. The day had only begun, and already the fever had claimed its audience. The chemist's shop sat at the corner of Mulberry Lane like a solemn sentinel, its windows fogged with frost and the lingering scent of dried herbs and powdered minerals. Behind the frosted glass, Mr. Alcott, the city's most cautious chemist, moved with deliberate care, his hands trembling slightly as he weighed compounds and adjusted delicate balances. The frost clung stubbornly to the windowpanes, obscuring the alley outside, where the slums of Brindle Court hummed with a fevered life, coughing, whispering, shivering, and, above all, drinking. Alcott paused in his work, peering through the icy glass. The pump across the street, half hidden by the morning mist, stood silent. For weeks it had groaned and gulped, a mechanical accomplice to the spreading illness, but now its silence pressed upon him like a warning. The murky water in the basins, the foaming suds on laundry, the pale, trembling children, all flowed from that same source. He rubbed his forehead, beads of sweat forming despite the chill. The frost seemed to intensify the heaviness in the shop, pressing in through cracks and crevices as though the air itself were conspiring with the illness. His shelves, normally lined with vials of tonics, powders, and tinctures, now bore the telltale gaps of panic. Mothers had come early that morning, pleading for anything to soothe their children. They left with empty bottles, shrunken wallets, and hearts heavier than before. A timid knock came at the door. Mr. Alcott adjusted his spectacles and opened it just enough to admit a thin woman clutching a basket. Her eyes, wide with fear, darted around the shop, taking in the empty shelves. "Please, sir," she whispered. "My little boy. He drank from the pump this morning. He shivers. He cries. What can I give him?" Alcott felt the familiar tug of helplessness, a gnawing despair he had long tried to smother behind the counter. I have nothing," he said softly. "Only what remains in these jars, and it is barely sufficient to soothe the smallest fevers." The woman's lips trembled. "Is it the water?" Alcott nodded, a grim acknowledgement. "It carries something unnatural, something that the body is unprepared to fight. Fever, nausea, delirium. It spreads faster than we can treat." She shivered and left, clutching a mere handful of bitter herbs. Alcott closed the door behind her, the bell's chime echoing hollowly in the frosted shop. He returned to his workbench, hands hovering over powders he could no longer trust to save anyone. Each measurement felt futile, each concoction a reminder that even skill, patience, and care might be insufficient against an illness born of rot, neglect, and hidden channels. He picked up a vial of fever-root tincture, staring at its amber liquid. The first batch had been effective, or so it seemed at the time. But the illness now moving through Brindle Court and Hollow Bend had grown stronger, adapting, spreading, twisting into forms the chemist could barely comprehend. He wondered if the sweetness that lingered on the children's breath was some cruel mockery, a flavor designed to invite trust before betrayal. Outside, the street murmured with activity. Mothers carried their children to the basin, fishermen hauled buckets of water from contaminated pumps, and the alleyways filled with faint, coppery odors that clung to boots, skirts, and rags. The frost on the windows captured the motion in ghostly patterns, freezing the chaos outside into a fragile tableau. Alcott sighed, placing the vial back on the counter. He pressed a hand to the frosted glass, peering at the silent pump once more. Its quietness was worse than its previous groans. Now it felt like an accusation. The water behind it moved through hidden channels, invisible yet deadly, creeping into every home, every heart, every hand that dared touch it. For the first time in weeks, the chemist felt entirely powerless. Science, method, and measure all had limits. All had failed against a force that was equal parts curiosity, necessity, and death. And in the frost-heavy morning, behind the shop's glass, Alcott understood a terrifying truth. The illness was no longer just a sickness. It had become a presence, patient and persistent, and he, the chemist behind the frosted glass, could do nothing but watch. The pump across the street remained silent, but its silence carried menace enough to chill every bone in the chemist's body. The Opera House on Bleakwater Street had never been a place for the poor, nor for the sick. Its gilded balconies and velvet seats belonged to the affluent, those who could afford the price of admission, the luxury of escape from the grime and grief of the city. Yet tonight, in the flickering gaslight of the alley behind the theatre, a secret had found its way into the shadows. The singer herself, Madame Valérie, exhaled in whispers the same poison that coursed through the slums. Her breath was not sweet in the sense of sugar or honey. It carried something subtler, something almost imperceptible, yet infectious, the faint coppery tang of water tainted by unseen channels. She had drunk from the pump earlier that day, under the guise of a perfumed water bottle, unnoticed by the footmen who flitted between her dressing room and the stage. And now, alone in the alley, she felt the first tremors of what the chemists and physicians whispered about, but could not yet name. The fever moving through her body, light yet insistent, like an uninvited audience that had settled in her chest. Madame Valérie pressed her gloved hand to her mouth, stifling the small cough that escaped anyway. She had always known the power of her voice, the ability to command the attention of a hall, to enchant and enrapture, but the secret breath that now hovered between her lungs and the frigid night air was her undoing. Every inhalation drew in the subtle poison, every exhalation released it, invisible yet potent, as though the slums themselves had discovered a new instrument. Her body. In the alley, damp from last night's mist and the faint drizzle that had passed unseen through the city, she paused. The cobblestones glistened like dark glass beneath her boots, and she could hear the distant hum of the pump, low, mechanical, patient. It had learned to wait. It had learned to observe. She had learned that the water she drank, so unremarkable in its appearance, carried not only her life but the lives of countless others, children, mothers, fathers, the sick and the healthy alike. Her mind, trained to memorize scales and notes, now worked to calculate the invisible currents of disease, the ripple effects of a single sip. She thought of the chemist behind the frosted glass, weighing tinctures and powders, hoping for salvation that would not arrive in time. She thought of the laundresses with their foam-covered rags, the basins that would not rinse clean, the mothers who carried their fevered children like fragile relics. And she realized, with a shiver that traveled down her spine, that her secret breath was not her own. It belonged to the city, to the water, to the illness that had grown sentient in its patience. She stumbled slightly, gripping the iron rail of a lamppost. The gaslight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to mock her. She coughed again, quietly, trying to mask it with the hem of her coat. The breath left her lips and disappeared into the fog, invisible yet insidious, a messenger that would touch others before she ever returned to the stage. The irony was not lost on her. In the very act that gave her life singing, inhaling, performing, she now unwittingly became an agent of death. The audience she had once captivated would never know the measure of her tragedy. She could not warn them. She could not stop the rhythm of the illness as it pulsed through the city. Madame Valérie took another step, careful not to stumble on the slick stones. She inhaled deeply, sensing the fever threading through her lungs, through her chest, through her very voice. She knew she must return to her apartment before the illness claimed her fully, yet each exhale carried with it a secret contagion, a truth about the water that no one in the gilded halls above would recognize until it was far too late. And so she moved through the fog-laden streets, a figure of elegance and despair, her secret breath mingling with the iron-tinged air. The city slept uneasily, yet even in dreams it inhaled her warning, carried silently by the one instrument that could not refuse its song, the human body itself. The fever had found its conduit, and for a moment the slums and the opera house were bound together by the invisible threads of poisoned air and secret breath. The hospital ward smelled of carbolic, antiseptic, and despair. The scent clung to every surface, a chemical pall meant to ward off contagion, yet failing against the true horror that had taken root within the city. Linen sheets, freshly laundered but damp with humidity, hung in stiff folds across narrow beds. The faint steam of boiling water drifted from buckets left at each bedside, carrying the subtle sweetness that had begun to betray life itself. Elias Harrow entered quietly, lantern in hand, feeling the familiar tug of helplessness that always accompanied the first step across the threshold. The ward was full, mothers pacing with fevered children, fathers who had insisted on accompanying their families despite their own weakness, nurses moving with mechanical precision, eyes glazed from exhaustion. The children's breaths rose in shallow, wheezing symphonies, each exhalation tinged with copper, each cough a reminder of the unseen menace that had seeped into every home, every vessel, every life. Mrs. Weller knelt beside her son Thomas, his small frame shaking with convulsions. She pressed a damp cloth to his brow, inhaling the faintly sweet smell that clung to his fevered skin. "He's burning," she whispered. "The doctor, can't you do something?" Elias leaned over the boy, his hands trembling slightly as he took Thomas's pulse. "We do what we can," he murmured, though even he knew that remedies, tinctures, and poultices were woefully insufficient against the invisible tide that had risen from the pumps. The illness moved not only through water but through the very fabric of the slums, threading itself into pipes, basins, and lungs alike. The nurse, a gaunt woman named Ruth, moved between beds with careful efficiency, changing soiled linens, administering the occasional dose of fever-reducing potion, whispering reassurances to frightened mothers. Yet her eyes betrayed a deeper understanding. The ward was not a place of healing tonight. It was a chamber of endurance, where bodies were watched over, where every breath was measured, where every slight improvement was celebrated only because the alternative inattention was unthinkable. Elias paused at a small bed near the window. A child, no more than 6, lay with eyes half closed, murmuring unintelligibly. The child's lips glistened with the telltale sweetness, and the skin of the cheeks shone with a faint sheen that spoke of fever yet unseen. Elias pressed his fingers lightly to the pulse, counting the frantic beats. It raced like a drum summoning doom. Outside the window, the fog pressed against the glass, curling around the ward in a silent, omnipresent threat. The iron scent of the streets mingled with the chemicals indoors, forming an invisible bridge between the city and the ward. Every cough from the alleyway below echoed faintly in the hall, and Elias felt it as though the illness were calling to him, daring him to intervene, to act, to stop it, though he knew the impossibility of such a task. A sudden clatter from the hallway drew his attention. Mrs. Dalloway had returned from fetching more clean water, her bucket empty and her expression haunted. "It's worse than before," she said softly. "Even the water we brought is tainted. Every sip, every wash, it carries the fever with it." Elias exhaled slowly, lantern light casting long shadows across the room. "Then we watch. We tend. We preserve what little we can, and we pray that the tide does not rise any further." A faint bubbling rose from one of the buckets near the door, unnoticed by all but Elias. He leaned closer, peering into the murky liquid. The surface shimmered, as though alive, reflecting the flickering gaslights in distorted patterns. He felt a shiver trace his spine. The ward smelled of carbolic, yes, but beneath it lingered something else, a sweetness, a corruption, a quiet, unyielding persistence that no antiseptic could erase. It was in the water, in the linens, in the very air, and it would not rest. And as the night stretched on, Elias knew that the ward had become more than a sanctuary. It was a bulwark, a fragile line against an enemy both invisible and relentless, where the sick lay in chemical-scented beds, and the living counted every breath as though it were borrowed, fleeting, and precious. The cart creaked as it rolled down the narrow alley, wheels rattling against uneven cobblestones slick with mist. Its wooden sides, patched and worn, were barely enough to hold the bundles stacked within. Blankets, coarse and thin, each one folded in haste, each one already carrying the faint odor of fever, sweat, and the coppery tang of illness. The cart belonged to the parish, or at least what was left of it after weeks of ceaseless tragedy, and it moved slowly, deliberately, through the slum, each turn of the wheels echoing like a drumbeat of foreboding. Mary Brindle followed alongside, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill. Her eyes flitted nervously over the rows of homes lining the alley, windows shuttered against the damp and the disease. Mothers stood at their doors, gripping children whose small forms trembled with the fever that had already claimed too many. Fathers leaned against walls, silent, gaunt, their hands twitching nervously as though to fend off some invisible hand. And the cart rolled on, each turn a reminder that the blankets were not for warmth alone, but for something far grimmer, to wrap the living as they awaited death, or to cover the dead who could no longer speak. Elias Harrow walked at the head of the cart, lantern swinging from his hand. His face, pale beneath the brim of his hat, was drawn with exhaustion and sorrow. He had accompanied such deliveries before, but never like this, never so many, never so urgently, never with a city's suffering folded into the fabric he now carried. The blankets were soaked in water, some still damp from attempts to cleanse them, but no cleansing would suffice. The illness had crept into the fibers themselves, lingering invisibly, waiting to meet flesh once more. Mrs. Weller, carrying her ailing son Thomas, watched the cart with wide eyes. The blankets reminded her too much of the sheets her husband had lain upon before succumbing to the fever, of the damp rags that had become the only protection for her child's trembling body. She whispered a prayer, though she knew it could do little to stem the invisible tide. The cart stopped at the edge of the courtyard, where a makeshift infirmary had been erected in the largest room of the tenement. Elias climbed down first, lantern held high, and gestured for the volunteers waiting inside. Together, they began unloading the blankets, stacking them in orderly piles that could hold the sick, the faintly alive, and, inevitably, the dead. Each bundle carried the weight of its occupant's story: a child lost to fever, a mother weakened by exhaustion, a father whose cough rattled like dry leaves in the wind. Mary assisted in laying the blankets out, her hands careful not to disturb the faint residue that lingered, a reminder of the water's secret treachery. She paused over one particularly large bundle, inhaling faintly. The coppery tang was stronger here, heavier, almost palpable, a warning of the presence it had carried, the lives it had touched. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, curling into the cracks and eaves like smoke from a distant fire. The alley was silent except for the soft scrape of wheels and the occasional cough that pierced the night air. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next inevitable wave of sickness to follow the cart, to trace the path of its contents, to claim another body or spirit. Elias straightened, lantern light reflecting off his weary eyes. "These blankets," he murmured, "are both salvation and testament. They carry warmth, yes, but they also carry the memory of the fever, the stain of the water, and the silent witnesses of all who have suffered. Handle them carefully, for they are heavier than mere cloth." Mary nodded, understanding fully. Each blanket was a vessel of life and death, soaked with stories, with sweat, with the whisper of disease. And as the cart was emptied, leaving only the echo of its wheels fading down the alley, the residents of the rookery knew that the night had only just begun, and the fever, patient and merciless, was still rising. The heavy curtains in the Chamber of Parliament muffled the distant clamour of the city, yet the muffling only deepened the weight pressing upon those inside. Behind these thick draperies, officials gathered around polished oak tables, their expressions polite but rigid, their hands clasped in manners meant to conceal unease. The city outside reeked of iron and sickness, and the whispers of fever and death had begun to seep through every window and doorway of the slums. But here, behind these protective walls, the problem was still a matter of discussion, not despair. Elias Harrow was not present, yet his reports hung like invisible spectres over the room, carried in carefully written letters and the urgent words of minor officials desperate to convey the reality they had witnessed firsthand. A map was unfurled on the table, its edges curling in the damp warmth of the chamber. Crisscrossing lines marked the boroughs most afflicted, red smudges denoting the densest concentrations of fever and collapse. The men and women in attendance studied these lines with practiced eyes, yet their comprehension seemed shallow, restrained by the abstraction of distance and comfort. The reports indicate a surge in morbidity across the southern districts, one official murmured, voice smooth yet tinged with unease. The pumps, their readings are inconsistent, but the water itself may carry contamination. A murmur ran through the assembly. Some adjusted waistcoats, others leaned back, crossing legs that had not known hardship in years. One man cleared his throat. "And yet," he said, "we have no confirmed epidemic. The evidence remains anecdotal." A shadow fell across the table as a senior physician, summoned from the city's hospitals, stepped forward. His hands were marked with traces of fever and sweat, a tangible reminder of the battle fought in wards that reeked of carbolic and iron. "Anecdotal?" he asked sharply. "I have seen children collapse mid-street. I have witnessed mothers carry their dead through alleys. I have smelled the water's corruption in every home I enter. How can this not be proof?" Polite nods were offered, yet the discussion circled, hesitant and constrained. Responsibility, bureaucracy, and fear of panic had formed invisible chains around the speakers. They debated the matter as though illness were a ledger to balance, rather than a living, creeping force poised to claim life. A clerk shuffled papers nervously. The city surveyors report that the pumps remain functional, albeit irregular. Contamination is unconfirmed, though traces of iron and sediment have been found. Standard purification protocols are in effect. The senior physician's eyes narrowed. "Standard protocols?" he repeated. "Have you walked the alleys? Have you seen the laundresses and children? Have you felt the heat of fever, the weight of death in every breath? The protocols are not enough, they never were, not against what now courses through the veins of the city." Silence pressed in, heavy as the curtains themselves. Outside, the gas lamps flickered through fog and damp, casting faint, restless shadows against the stone streets, where the living and the dying intermingled in ways the chamber could not yet comprehend. One of the lords, a man whose hands had never been calloused, cleared his throat and offered a solution half measured in care, half in avoidance. Perhaps increased inspection of the pumps, careful oversight of the distribution, and the physician shook his head slowly. Inspection does not suffice. Oversight cannot reach the heart of the contamination. The water has become a carrier of death, patient, silent, invisible. It moves faster than the law, faster than letters, faster than those who would intervene. By the time your inspectors note it, it will have claimed more lives than you can count. The room fell silent again, and in that pause, the weight of helplessness seeped into the polished wood, curling around every chair and desk. Outside, a distant groan echoed from the slums, a sound carried on damp air, faint but unmistakable, as if the city itself had pressed a finger against the glass, demanding recognition. Behind Parliament's curtains, the officials sat rigid, faces pale in the glow of candlelight. The decisions to come would be small and incremental, filtered through procedure, caution, and fear of panic. Yet the fever that had crept through alleys and alleys, carried in water and whispered in gaslit streets, would not wait for consent or ceremony. Elias Harrow's reports were not letters anymore, they were warnings. And the city beyond the chamber would continue to pay for each hour of inaction, each debate drawn out by civility, each measure delayed behind the thick curtains meant to shield the powerful from the immediacy of suffering. The fever waited, patient, relentless, and unobserved by those who could intervene for now. The river had always been the lifeblood of the city, its dark, sluggish currents carrying coal, timber, and refuse from the mills upriver down to the docks below. But lately it had begun to betray its own innocence. Dock workers spoke in hushed tones of strange swirls along the surface, foam curling in pale, ghostly coils that did not dissipate but lingered, gliding toward the piers like something alive. Samuel Hargrave, a man of broad shoulders and calloused hands, had been tending the loading cranes when he first noticed it. The foam clung to the hulls of barges and tugs, curling around ropes and piling against the timber in delicate, unnatural patterns. It was not the froth of the tide, nor the natural effervescence from salt and brine. This was different, metallic, sweet, subtle, and yet unmistakably wrong. He leaned over the railing, gripping the slick iron with fingers trembling not from cold but from unease. The mist from the river clung to his coat, chilling him through the wool. A fish broke the surface, its scales reflecting the weak morning light, and vanished beneath the foam, leaving a trail of disturbance in its wake. But the trail did not fade. It lingered, mingling with the water in delicate swirls, whispering a secret that Samuel dared not name. "Hargrave," shouted another dockhand, breaking the spell. "Get those barrels loaded. We're behind schedule." Samuel forced himself to look away, though the image of the river lingered in his mind like a fevered dream. The foam, the unnatural shimmer, the faint scent of iron, all pressed against him. He bent to move the barrels, hands fumbling over damp ropes, yet every motion seemed accompanied by the memory of the water curling beneath the pier, as though it were aware of him, waiting, patient. By midday, rumours had spread along the docks. Sailors spoke in low voices of children falling ill near the riverside, mothers carrying fevered infants past warehouses, and the same faint, sweet tang lingering in the air. It was said the foam had appeared in pockets along the river, not continuous, but enough to suggest a malignancy spreading quietly beneath the surface. The captains of the tugs and barges avoided the water when possible, dipping ropes and hooks into its currents only reluctantly, fearful of touching something that had claimed life invisibly and without mercy. Samuel watched as a lad from the warehouse stooped to scoop a small amount of the water for the horses to drink. The foam clung to the pail's edges, leaving a faint residue, and Samuel's stomach knotted as he recognized the same coppery scent he had smelled days earlier at the pump near the slums. "They say it's poison," Samuel muttered to the man beside him. "Some sickness in the water, they say. People dying, falling in the alleys, and the river, it carries it now." The other man nodded, pale, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the chill. "Aye," he said, "and if it reaches the warehouses, if it reaches the city, God help us all." Elias Harrow arrived at the docks that evening, lantern swinging, his coat dusted with soot and frost. He moved to Samuel, taking the man aside, examining the river's surface as the tide licked against the posts. "It's worse than I feared," he said, voice low and tight. "The contamination is no longer confined to the slums. The river carries it beyond homes, beyond streets, beyond what we can reach with basins and buckets." Samuel swallowed, tasting the metallic tang still lingering in the fog. "Can it be stopped?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The water, patient and deliberate, had begun its slow, relentless spread. Elias shook his head. Not quickly, not easily, and not without cost. Behind them, the river bubbled faintly, the foam drifting toward the docks with a quiet persistence. A child's cough echoed somewhere along the embankment. A dog barked in the distance, its sound swallowed immediately by the fog. The river waited, patient, silent, and unyielding, carrying the sickness in its dark, undulating veins, indifferent to the lives it touched, indifferent to the cries it left behind. The dockworker turned away, gripping the rail as though to steady himself. The river had become more than water. It had become a herald of the fever yet to come. And in that cold, damp morning mist, Samuel knew the city itself was infected. The bell tolled at midday, though no one could recall why. Its heavy sound echoed through the narrow alleys and over the soot-stained rooftops, a sonorous reminder that life in the slums was measured not in hours or days, but in misfortune. It struck once, twice, 3 times, each reverberation lingering longer than the last, cutting through the damp air like an omen that had been awaited yet dreaded in equal measure. Mary Brindle paused at her window, a folded cloth in her hands. The children playing in the street below ceased their games, listening with wide eyes as the deep tones settled into the corners of the rookery. She counted the tolls along with the others, 1, 2, 3, and then stopped. The 4th had already begun before she had completed her mental reckoning, a cruel discrepancy that left a hollow ache in her chest. No one had counted the bell properly, no one ever did. And yet its rhythm had begun to mark more than time. It marked absence, loss, the gradual disappearance of lives into fevered oblivion. Inside the tenement, the smell of iron and damp laundry mingled with the faint chemical tang of carbolic from the hospital ward. Elias Harrow moved between rooms, taking the pulse of children, noting the pallor of their lips, the weight of sweat-slicked sheets, the subtle sweetness clinging to breath that should have been innocent. With each toll of the bell, he noted another deterioration, another fever climbing, another small body succumbing to the invisible scourge that had poisoned the pumps, the basins, the very air of the city. Outside, the alleys had grown quieter. Mothers whispered, carrying buckets of water that tasted of copper, of sweetness, of death. Fathers leaned against walls, their boots smeared with mud and the residue of the river, hands gripping what remained of their dignity. The bell tolled again, its sound passing over their heads and into the alleys like the measured step of a judge, impartial, unyielding, yet merciless. In one corner, Mrs. Dalloway's child coughed, low and wet, shivering beneath a threadbare blanket. The bell's vibration seemed to answer the cough, the sound and the illness entwined in a sinister duet. Mary knelt beside the child, pressing a cool hand to the fevered brow, tasting the faint iron on her own lips, a reminder that none were untouched. Each toll seemed to pull at the life within the room, drawing out the energy of the living and marking it for what would soon be lost. At the churchyard, a block away, the bell swung lazily in its tower, its rope worn smooth by the hands of generations long dead. Graveyards, long neglected, had begun to fill again, though the undertaker's records were incomplete, their numbers tentative. 1 toll, 2 tolls, each seemed to correspond with the silent departures that passed uncounted in the slums. Children, mothers, fathers, neighbors, their passing measured not by hours, but by the metallic echo of the bell and the persistent, invisible fever that had claimed them before they could cry out. Elias returned to the hall where makeshift cots lined every available space. The lantern cast trembling shadows across the faces of those still conscious, some delirious, some simply exhausted, all enveloped in the same unrelenting quiet. He listened as the bell tolled again, counting deliberately this time, noting the progression of deaths with the precision of a man who had long since abandoned hope that any authority would intervene. Mary's eyes rested on Elias, understanding the weight he bore. The tolling bell was not merely a signal of time, it was a reckoning, a reminder that no one was truly safe, that the water, the air, and now even the sound of the city itself carried a warning. Outside, the fog swirled through the alleys and along the riverbanks. The bell tolled once more, deep and resonant, a lament for lives unseen, uncounted, and already surrendered to the fever that had come quietly, persistently, and without mercy. And in the silence that followed, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting, listening, and mourning. The undertaker's yard reeked of damp earth, wax, and the faintly sweet stench that had begun to pervade the slums. Wooden carts lined the narrow path, some empty, some bearing the pallid forms of the recently deceased, draped in thin linen, weighted with the inevitability of their fate. For weeks, the undertaker, Mr. Wren, had worked with a quiet desperation, his hands roughened not merely by labor, but by the relentless confrontation with death itself. Now, he realized, his business had overflowed, and no ledger could keep pace with the mounting toll. He moved between the carts with careful, measured steps, inspecting each bundle, counting silently as the fog clung to his coat and hair. The sweet tang of iron and decay lingered in the air, a reminder that the illness had begun far before the first bodies arrived. Fever, sweat, and the unclean water had carried death through alleys, into homes, and now to his yard. Every cart was fuller than it should have been, every body heavier with the burden of a fevered life, snatched too soon. A thin boy, no older than 12, followed Mr. Wren nervously, carrying small bundles of blankets meant to wrap the deceased. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he touched the damp linen. He had seen his mother fall ill 2 nights before, her breath carrying the sweetness that heralded the fever's advance, and he had not dared to wake her until it was too late. Now he handled the blankets like a confessor, handling sacred relics, with care, reverence, and fear. Mary Brindle approached, eyes scanning the overflowing yard. She had witnessed more sorrow than she could bear, yet the sight of the undertaker's overloaded carts still pressed against her chest with the weight of inevitability. "How many today?" she asked, voice low, almost a whisper. Mr. Wren adjusted his hat, shoulders stiffened under the cold mist. "Too many," he said simply. "And still more coming. The carts won't hold them all." The fog shifted, curling around the carts and across the wet ground, and the smell of iron intensified. It was not just the scent of blood, but of water tainted, of life stolen quietly, invisibly. The fever had made its presence known in every alley, every home, every child's tremor, and now in every bundle waiting for the rites of burial. A mother approached, clutching the limp form of her youngest, her apron pressed against his forehead. She knelt before Mr. Wren, tears running unchecked. He drank from the pump. The water, it burned him inside. "Please, sir, bury him gently." Mr. Wren nodded, motioning for the boy to fetch a new blanket. Each movement was precise, deliberate, as though haste could undo what had already occurred. Yet nothing could. The fever had already worked its dark alchemy, leaving only the body, pale and sweet-smelling, a silent testament to the water's treachery. Elias Harrow arrived shortly after, lantern casting a flickering light across the yard. He moved between the carts, his hand brushing the damp linen, noting the sheen of fever that clung even in death. He bent over a child whose small chest had ceased its trembling. The sweet tang lingered in the air, almost palpable. "It spreads faster than we can bury," he murmured, voice low. "Faster than we can heal, faster than we can understand." Mary shivered, drawing her shawl tighter. The yard seemed to pulse with a quiet menace, as though the illness had taken form in the mist, hovering above each cart, waiting, observing. Mr. Wren's hands shook slightly as he tied a bundle. "We cannot stop it," he said quietly. "All we can do is manage the overflow, mark the dead, and hope the living endure a while longer." Outside, the fog thickened, rolling from the riverbanks, curling through the alleys. Somewhere distant, the pump exhaled a hollow gulp, an unseen herald of the fever yet to come. And in the undertaker's yard, with carts overflowing, blankets stacked like muted witnesses, and the sweet, iron-tinged air pressing close, the city understood death had claimed its due, and would continue to claim more. The undertaker paused, glancing over the yard. Each bundle, each body, each pallid hand was a testament to the slow, inexorable persistence of the fever. And as night settled over the slums, heavy and unrelenting, he realized that the overflow was no longer a circumstance. It was a herald, a warning of the darkness still to come. The cart moved like a slow, inevitable heartbeat through the winding alleys of the slum, its wheels creaking against the uneven cobblestones, each turn sending tremors through the thin walls of the tenements. It was not a cart of commerce, nor one of cheer. It was a cart of measure, of reckoning, and of dread. Its wooden sides bore the scratches and scars of weeks of relentless labor, and its load bundles of linen, blankets, and hastily gathered garments carried the invisible imprint of fever, sweat, and the secret, sickly sweetness of the water that had claimed so many. Mary Brindle followed at a careful distance, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, eyes tracing the bundles as though she might divine the stories contained within them. Each blanket represented a body, each rag a child or mother or father, marked by the invisible touch of disease. The cart did not merely carry supplies, it carried the weight of the city's fear, a tangible testament to the illness that had seeped into pipes, basins, and now the very streets themselves. Elias Harrow walked alongside, lantern swinging in rhythm with his steps. His expression was taut with exhaustion, his eyes scanning the faces of the mothers and children who lingered at windows or doors, watching the slow procession. He noted the subtle pallor of cheeks, the trembling of hands, the faint iron scent clinging to garments already touched by the fever. The cart, he realized with grim precision, had become a tracker of the illness, its route revealing the invisible currents of the plague as it flowed through the slums. At the first intersection, the cart stopped briefly as a mother approached, clutching her daughter close. The child's breaths were shallow and rapid, lips tinged with the sweetness that had become the signature of the illness. She looked up at Elias, eyes wide with desperation. Is there nothing left? Nothing at all to save her? He shook his head slowly. Only care, and perhaps a little comfort. The fever moves faster than any tincture we possess, faster than any remedy we can provide. We can track it, observe it, tend to it where we can, but it will not be stopped by our hands alone. The mother's gaze followed the cart as it creaked forward, and she whispered a prayer, though even the prayer felt fragile, insubstantial, against the relentless tide of disease. At the next corner, a laundress leaned from her doorway, wringing her hands as she watched the cart pass. Her basins still held water tinged with the same eerie haze, and she shivered as she recalled the children who had collapsed mid-wash, the mothers who had fallen faint from exhaustion, the men who had grown weak from a single cup drawn from the poisoned pump. It follows us, she whispered to herself, voice trembling. Everywhere it follows us. Elias's eyes narrowed. He could see it, now, as clearly as the cobblestones beneath the cart's wheels. The illness was mapped not by walls or windows, but by the path of this simple vehicle. Every street it passed, every alley it turned, revealed another cluster of fevered bodies, another home touched by the silent contagion. The cart stopped again at the central alley where the basins of Brindle Court had overflowed just days before. Here, a small group of children sat huddled under blankets, too weak to move, too fevered to cry. The iron scent of illness was heavier here, curling into the folds of the fabric, saturating the damp stones. Elias knelt beside them, checking pulses, pressing cool cloths to foreheads, whispering quiet words that felt hollow against the scale of the epidemic. Mary looked around at the gathering fog, the alleys shrouded in pale mist, the faint glow of gaslights reflecting off the cobblestones. She understood, finally, the cruel truth. The cart did not merely deliver blankets. It traced the path of death, the root of the fever, the invisible hand of the poisoned water. As the wheels creaked onward, carrying the weight of the city's misery, the slum seemed to breathe in unison, a collective inhalation of fear, exhaustion, and the quiet certainty that the plague was still rising, still moving, still patient, and the cart, creaking steadily through the fog, would continue to track it, a grim herald of the suffering that lay ahead. The cistern had long been forgotten, hidden beneath a lattice of cobblestones and the shadowed eaves of the tenement above. Its presence was known to few, a relic of older plumbing, half sealed by neglect and years of sludge. But now, as the fever consumed Brindle Court and the alleys beyond, the cistern had become something far more sinister, a reservoir of disease, patient and persistent, exhaling a stench that could not be ignored. Mary Brindle approached the trapdoor cautiously, her shawl pulled tightly against the chill that seemed to seep from the very stones themselves. The odor hit her first, a bitter, metallic tang woven with something sweet, almost cloying, that made her stomach turn. It was not merely water, nor merely decay. It was a fusion of both, the silent accumulation of weeks of illness, rot, and human neglect. She gagged lightly, covering her nose with a gloved hand. Elias Harrow knelt beside the opening, lantern in hand, the light trembling against the edges of the trapdoor. "The cistern," he whispered, voice low, as though speaking too loudly might awaken the menace within. "It has become the heart of the contamination. The pump, the basins, the foam on laundry, all trace back here. Every household touched, every fevered body, flows through this singular, hidden channel." Mary swallowed against the rising bile. "We have children still drinking from the barrels, unaware. They do not know the danger beneath their feet." Elias's hand brushed against the trapdoor, lingering a moment on the damp wood. They never will, until it is too late. The water has learned patience, it has learned concealment, and beneath this lid lies proof of its cruelty, waiting to claim the next body. A faint groan rose from the alley behind them, a child coughing, its tiny lungs filled with the sweet-tasting poison. Mary flinched. The sound carried into the cistern as if the very air conspired with the disease, mixing fear and reality in a single breath. Elias lowered the lantern carefully into the opening. The light reflected off the water below, revealing a churning surface, rippled faintly as though some invisible hand pushed against it from beneath. The odor grew stronger, searing at the back of the throat, twisting with every inhalation. Bits of debris floated at the surface, linen fibers, fragments of wood, traces of coal dust. Each fleck seemed charged, imbued with the fever's relentless patience. He lowered a sampling vial into the murky depths, the liquid swirling around it in oily, iridescent coils. When he lifted it, the coppery tang clung to his gloved fingers. He turned it in the lantern light. "This is no ordinary contamination," he said. "It is concentrated, insidious, and spreading faster than any report can capture. The cistern is a womb for the illness, nurturing it, carrying it unseen to every pump, every basin, every unsuspecting mouth." Mary's eyes followed the vial as Elias set it carefully on the ground. "What can we do? We cannot empty it. We cannot cleanse it fast enough. And yet," her voice faltered, "we must try." A faint splashing echoed from the depths, a whisper of movement. Mary recoiled. The water did not merely sit, it stirred, deliberate and aware. She shivered, imagining the slow, patient spread that had already claimed so many lives, imagining the fever rising from this dark cradle to the living above. Elias closed the trapdoor gently, sealing the cistern once more. The stench lingered, curling through the alley and into the tenement above. It pressed against walls, seeped into fabrics, invaded every breath. The hidden reservoir of disease had not been destroyed. It waited, patient, knowing that every delay, every moment of ignorance, would bring the next victim to its surface. Mary stood beside him in the fog, understanding fully. The cistern was no longer a container of water. It was a vessel of death, a silent witness to the city's slow unraveling, and beneath the stone it would continue to wait, watch, and claim its due. Outside, the wind carried a faint coppery tang through the alley, and the city exhaled in anxious anticipation, unaware that beneath their feet the cistern had already begun its next careful work. The candlelight flickered across the rough drafting table, illuminating a tangle of parchment, inked lines, and carefully measured annotations. Elias Harrow leaned over the blueprints, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line, as his hand traced the curves of pipes, the locations of pumps, the cisterns that had betrayed the city. Each line represented more than infrastructure. It represented survival, a fragile hope in the face of fever, foam, and the insidious sweetness that lingered in every cup drawn from tainted water. Mary Brindle stood behind him, shawl drawn tight over her shoulders, watching the lantern light tremble across the drawings. "Do you truly believe it can be done?" she asked, voice soft, almost a whisper. "After all that's happened, after the fever, the children, the laundresses, can we cleanse the water fast enough to make a difference?" Elias did not answer immediately. He traced the path from the main river intake, past the tangled underworks, toward every pump in the rookery. He had seen the contamination spread like a shadow moving beneath the cobblestones, patient, relentless. He had walked the alleys, measured the flow in basins, noted the iron tang and sweetness that betrayed its presence, and still, as he traced the lines of his plan, he felt a cautious glimmer of possibility. "It is possible," he said at last, voice low but steady. "If we act quickly, systematically, we must isolate the pumps, flush the pipes, treat the cisterns. The blueprint must guide every hand, every volunteer, every ounce of clean water we can bring to bear. Mary bent closer, studying the lines. And the labourers? The parish? Will they understand what is required? The city council? They have debated endlessly, and still the fever claims more. Elias pressed his fingers to the parchment. They will have to. There is no other choice. The blueprint is more than lines on paper, it is a map of life and death. If we fail to follow it exactly, the fever will continue to spread. If we succeed, we may yet save those who remain. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, curling along the streets, carrying the faint coppery tang of water and decay. The sound of coughing rose and fell from tenements beyond the drafting room. Each cough, each wheeze, each faint cry was a reminder of urgency, of the stakes pressed upon the city by the invisible menace flowing through every alley, every basin, every pail. Elias drew a deep breath, dipping his pen into ink, and began to annotate the blueprint further. Every pipe, every valve, every cistern received a mark, a note of inspection, a direction for flushing, a plan for temporary isolation. He drew symbols for makeshift filtration cloths, sand, charcoal, knowing they could only slow the spread, not stop it entirely. Mary watched him, hands clasped tightly. "Do you think the fever will relent?" she asked quietly, as if speaking aloud might summon its attention. Elias's gaze lifted, meeting hers. "No," he said, voice heavy. "It will not relent. It is patient, precise, and merciless, but we may yet outpace it not by chance but by careful planning, by deliberate action. This blueprint is our only hope." He leaned back, eyes weary, lantern light reflecting in the ink-stained lines. The room was quiet, except for the occasional cough from the street below. Each line on the parchment was a promise, a strategy, and a warning. The fever would continue its relentless advance, patient and invisible. But now, for the first time in weeks, the possibility of resistance took shape. A careful, methodical plan to reclaim the water, to cleanse the pipes, to protect the living from the hidden poison that had invaded every facet of their daily lives. And as Mary Brindle folded her shawl tighter around her shoulders, she understood the gravity of the work before them. The blueprint was more than paper. It was a lifeline. One misstep, one delay, and the fever would claim another generation. But if they followed it with precision, perhaps, just perhaps, the slums could breathe again. The brewery loomed over the narrow alley like a dark sentinel, its brick walls streaked with soot and the residue of 100 winters. The air around it was thick with the acrid sweetness of fermenting grains, mingled now with the iron tang that had come to haunt the city. Beneath this industrial edifice, hidden from all but the most observant, a pipe ran ancient, cracked, and betrayed by years of neglect. It was here, buried beneath the brewery's foundation, that the fever had found its secret conduit, carrying death silently toward the living above. Elias Harrow crouched at the edge of the alley, lantern held high, peering down into a small opening near the foundation. The smell was immediate, damp, metallic, with that faint, sickly sweetness that heralded the illness. He pressed a hand to the cold stone, feeling the subtle vibrations of water moving through the pipe, relentless, patient, and invisible. It pulsed beneath him, carrying fever, decay, and the quiet promise of more lives claimed before any could be saved. Mary Brindle stood behind him, shawl pulled tight, eyes wide in apprehension. "Beneath the brewery?" she whispered. "But no one would ever think to check there." "Exactly," Elias said, voice low. "The fever moves where we cannot see. The water has learned patience. It flows through these hidden channels, bypassing the pumps we monitor, infiltrating the homes we believe safe. This pipe, it is the artery of the next wave." He lowered a sampling vial into the opening. careful not to disturb the fragile soil and debris around it. The water rose slowly, swirling with sediment and a faintly oily sheen, catching the lantern's light like a warning. When he lifted the vial, he could see tiny particles suspended within it, rust, organic matter, perhaps even traces of the fever itself. The coppery tang clung to his gloves, and he brought his fingers to his lips, recoiling at the taste. A low groan rose from the alley below, somewhere near the slum's perimeter. A child, coughing, stumbled against a wall, eyes rolling in fevered confusion. Mary shivered, pressing her hands to her chest. "It spreads too fast," she said. "Even if we follow the blueprint, it may already have touched more homes than we know." Elias nodded grimly. Every house connected to this pipe is at risk. Every family drawing water from the adjacent pumps, every laundress washing clothes in these basins, every mother giving her child a cup of tea, all of them exposed. The brewery stands unaware of the death flowing beneath its foundations. The fog drifted in from the river, curling around the brewery's walls, carrying the faint, pervasive stench of iron and illness. Each inhalation pressed the urgency upon them like a physical weight. The pipe beneath the brewery had been hidden for decades, and in its concealment it had become a silent accomplice, distributing poison without fanfare, without notice. Elias lowered the lantern slightly, studying the brickwork around the pipe. "We will need to excavate carefully," he said. "Any misstep could rupture the pipe further, releasing more contaminated water into the alleys and homes above. It will be painstaking, dangerous work. But if we do not, the fever will claim more lives." Mary swallowed hard. "And the workers? The parish? Who will descend into the damp, dark earth to do this?" Elias's jaw tightened. "We have no choice. Volunteers, the chemist, the nurses, anyone willing. The city will not intervene on its own. We must act quietly, precisely, before the next wave rises." The cart of blankets, emptied earlier in the day, waited nearby, a silent witness to the suffering already endured. The brewery's shadow stretched across the alley, cold and unyielding. Beneath it, the pipe pulsed slowly, patient and merciless, carrying fever and the sweetness of iron-laced water toward homes yet untainted yet. Mary pressed a hand to the wall, feeling the vibrations beneath her fingers. "It waits," she whispered. "It watches. It knows." Elias nodded, lantern light trembling against his face. "And if we do not act," he said softly, "it will take everything it can reach." Outside, the fog thickened, carrying with it the distant sound of coughing, the faint scrape of boots against stone, and the knowledge that beneath the brewery, the pipe waited patient, hidden, unrelenting for the next victim. The ward was quiet, though quiet in the slums was never comfort. Lamps flickered weakly against walls that reeked of carbolic, damp linen, and the faint sweetness that clung to fevered breath. Nurses moved between beds, their motions practiced, automatic, each gesture a mechanical repetition learned through weeks of exhaustion and sorrow. But one nurse, Ruth, had found herself performing a task more harrowing than tending the living, washing the dead. The first body lay draped in a thin sheet, skin pallid and shining faintly with the residue of fever. Ruth approached it with a basin of water, hands trembling beneath rubber gloves, her heart beating not with fear but with the weight of responsibility. She dipped the cloth into the water and pressed it gently against the corpse's forehead. The liquid carried the faint iron tang that had become the signature of the illness, and she recoiled slightly, though she knew that hesitation could not be afforded. Each movement was deliberate. She washed the child's hands, thin and small, frail with the fever that had claimed them. She rinsed the cheeks, careful to avoid the lips that still carried the faint sweetness of contamination. Every motion was performed with precision, yet beneath the care lay a gnawing dread. The illness had not been vanquished by death. Its touch lingered in the water, in the linens, in the air itself. Mary Brindle observed from the corner, shawl pulled tight, lips pressed together. She had helped where she could, but washing the dead required a resolve beyond endurance, a willingness to confront mortality, stripped of ceremony or comfort. She shivered as Ruth lifted a small bundle of damp clothing from the bed, wringing it slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of lives already claimed by the fever. Elias Harrow moved between the beds, checking pulses of the living, noting the pallor of cheeks, the sheen of sweat on fevered skin. He approached Ruth quietly, lantern light glinting off the basin. "The water," he said softly, "is still contaminated. Even in death, the bodies carry traces of the illness. Be careful." Ruth nodded, though her hands shook. "I've seen it," she murmured. Even after the fever leaves, the smell, the tang of iron, it lingers. The dead carry it as if the city itself refuses to release them. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, curling around the brickwork, carrying with it the faint, pervasive smell of the slums. Iron, soot, and the subtle sweet promise of illness. Each cough, each groan from the wards seemed magnified, echoing across the walls and down the alleys, reaching ears unprepared for its insistence. Ruth moved to the next bed, a young mother who had succumbed in the night. The woman's breath had stopped hours earlier, yet the sheen on her skin remained. Ruth washed carefully, dipping the cloth again and again into the basin, wringing it slowly, removing the residue of fever and the sweet tang of poisoned water. Her hands were raw, her arms weary, yet she continued, knowing that in every fold of linen lay evidence of the fever's reach, of the water's silent, merciless work. Mary leaned closer. "How do you bear it?" she asked quietly. Ruth's eyes did not leave the body before her. "By remembering," she whispered. "Remembering who they were, what they drank, what they loved, and by knowing that if I do this poorly, the living may drink the same water tomorrow and fall as they did." Elias stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Ruth's shoulder. "The fever is relentless," he said, "but so are you. Your care, your precision, it saves more than you realize." The fog outside thickened, pressing against the panes like a living thing. The water in the basins trembled faintly, reflecting lantern light in wavering patterns. Ruth lifted the last cloth, wrung it carefully, and set it aside. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the dead pressing upon her, the fever waiting silently for its next touch. In that ward, amidst the scent of carbolic and the sweetness of iron-laden water, Ruth understood fully. Death had claimed the bodies, but the fever, patient, invisible, relentless, still roamed, waiting for the living to falter. The city itself seemed to resist cleansing, as if the fever had seeped into the very foundations, into the stone and timber, into the iron of the pumps and the copper of the riverbanks. Brindle Court, Hollow Bend, and the alleys between them reeked of damp, sweat, and the subtle, insidious sweetness of illness. Laundry that should have rinsed clean retained a pallid haze. Basins overflowed with water that bore the metallic tang of infection. Every attempt at purification seemed to falter, as though the city itself refused the notion of renewal. Mary Brindle moved from doorway to doorway, carrying pails of water that had been boiled and strained, yet still tasted faintly sweet. Children clung to her skirts, faces flushed with fever, eyes glassy with exhaustion. Mothers followed silently, whispering complaints, murmuring prayers, rubbing foreheads and necks in futile attempts to ward off the invisible presence that pressed into every pore. The city smelled of iron, of decay, of the fevered breath that had spread unseen for days. Elias Harrow followed closely, lantern swinging, his coat damp from the fog that clung to every corner. He stopped beside a young laundress who had collapsed over her basin, scrubbing clothes she would never finish. Her fingers were pale, tremulous, and the water she worked with bore the sheen of contamination. He knelt beside her, pressing a hand to her wrist. The pulse raced beneath his fingers, rapid and shallow, echoing the relentless beat of the fever that had claimed the city. "We cannot keep up," Mary whispered. "Every bucket, every basin, every attempt to wash or clean, it fails. The water itself refuses to yield to us." Elias pressed his lips together, staring down the alley. "The city will not wash itself until the source is addressed. The pumps, the cisterns, the hidden channels, they must be cleansed. Only then can the living hope to reclaim their homes, their basins, their lives." A child coughed nearby, weak and wet, and the sound seemed to reverberate through the buildings. Laundry hung limp on lines, damp and foaming, carrying the faint scent of iron into the street. Even the fog that drifted through the alleys seemed tainted, thickened with the invisible fever, pressing against walls, curling into cracks, invading every crevice. Mary knelt beside a mother who was cradling a fevered infant. The baby's lips were tinged with sweetness, breath shallow and rapid. She handed the mother a cloth, soaked in boiled water, and pressed it to the child's forehead. But the sheen remained, clinging to skin as if the fever had taken root within the very molecules. Elias moved between the alleys and courtyards, noting each pool of water that had stagnated, each basin that refused to rinse clean, each child or adult who trembled against the persistent presence of the illness. The city itself seemed complicit, as though the stones, the mortar, and the iron pipes had absorbed the fever and now exhaled it slowly, deliberately, into every household. "Even the river," Mary murmured, pointing toward the Thames, its surface curling with pale foam. "It won't wash itself. It carries the sickness from one end of the city to the other, and we are powerless to stop it." Elias's jaw tightened. "Then we act. We isolate. We cleanse. We carry water from outside. Every step we take is resistance, and resistance is all that remains." The fog thickened, curling around the lamp-lit alleys, the steam rising from basins and laundry, mixing with the metallic tang of disease. Children coughed, mothers whispered, and the city patient, unyielding, refused to wash itself, refusing to release the fever it had nurtured beneath cobblestones, beneath timber, beneath every roof. Mary Brindle pressed a hand to her forehead, eyes scanning the alleys. "It watches us," she said softly. "It knows what we do, what we cannot do, and it waits." Elias nodded. "And we must continue," he said quietly, "because if the city refuses to wash, the fever will claim it entirely: stone, iron, wood, and all who dwell upon it." Outside, the fog curled tighter. The sweetness of iron lingered in the damp air, and the city breathed slowly, deliberately, in time with the relentless, unyielding heartbeat of the fever. The office of the Director of Waterworks sat high above the streets, its windows fogged with condensation, the faint scent of iron and ink mingling with the lingering smoke of coal fires from below. Behind the polished desk, papers lay stacked in meticulous piles, each one a report of the city's water, the pumps, the cisterns, and the hidden channels that had become conduits of death. The man in the chair, Director Pembroke, stared at the documents with a quiet rigidity, a careful composure that barely concealed the unease tightening in his chest. He had been summoned repeatedly, urged by physicians, aldermen, and concerned citizens to take immediate action. Each report, each letter, each whispered warning carried the weight of reality, the fever rising through Brindle Court, Hollow Bend, and the alleys beyond. Children had collapsed, mothers had fainted, laundresses had fallen into basins, and the metallic sweetness lingered in the air, a signature of the invisible enemy coursing through the city. And yet he hesitated. The reason was not ignorance, nor negligence. It was fear. Fear of the scandal, the cost, the disruption of the carefully maintained order he had spent decades upholding. A full purge of the city's water system would require closing pumps, excavating cisterns, flushing the hidden channels, and halting commerce. It would draw attention, provoke outrage, and expose the city's unpreparedness. And still, the letters piled up, urgent, trembling, reporting collapse after collapse, the slow, persistent claim of lives by a menace that no bureaucracy could fully see or control. "Sir," said a clerk, breaking the silence. His voice trembled slightly, carrying the urgency of what he had witnessed firsthand. "The reports from the wards are worsening. The chemists are overwhelmed. The pumps are failing. They say children are collapsing mid-street, mothers are fevered and delirious, and even the apprentices who deliver water are falling ill. Immediate action is necessary." Director Pembroke leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed against his temple. He closed his eyes, imagining the map that had been drawn from the reports. Red stains marking Brindle Court, Hollow Bend, Mulberry Lane, the alleys and courtyards of the slums where water had betrayed the city. The fever had been patient, insidious, creeping beneath every stone and timber. The reports did not lie. They were the ledger of death. "And if we act too quickly," he murmured to himself, "the panic will spread. The people will riot. The city will blame the administration for failing to provide clean water earlier. But if we do nothing," the clerk pressed, voice sharper now, edged with desperation, "more will die. Already the undertaker's yard overflows. The hospitals cannot contain the fever. Each hour of hesitation brings more bodies, more suffering, more children whose lips carry the sweetness of poisoned water." Pembroke opened his eyes, staring through the fogged window at the city below. The Thames flowed darkly, its surface curling with pale foam that reflected the weak light of gas lamps. Every pump, every cistern, every alley below seemed a conduit of inevitability, a network through which the fever moved freely, silently, and mercilessly. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down like the stones themselves, heavy, immovable. To act was to risk upheaval, scandal, and accusation. To hesitate was to allow the fever to spread unchecked, claiming life after life. Minutes passed like hours. He glanced at the letters again, each one trembling with urgency, each one a fragment of a city slowly dying beneath his feet. His hands tightened on the desk, fingers whitening, knuckles straining. Outside, the fog thickened, curling through streets and alleys, carrying the metallic sweet tang of illness into every corner of the slums. Finally, he leaned back, exhaled slowly, and touched the ink-stained map. The decision weighed upon him like iron. The pumps had already begun their silent, deliberate work, carrying fever through pipes and basins, through homes and children, through laundresses' hands and mothers' lips. Hesitation had allowed the illness to take root, and in the quiet of his office, high above the city, Director Pembroke understood fully. His delay had made him complicit. The water flowed below, patient and unrelenting, and the city waiting for someone, anyone, to act before the fever claimed more. The hall of inquiry was cold, vast, and suffused with the weight of papers, ink, and the subtle, lingering tang of iron that had begun to permeate the city. Candles flickered against the high windows, their light catching on stacks of sealed evidence, letters from physicians, notes from laundresses, reports from chemists, and vials of water taken from every pump, cistern, and basin deemed suspicious. Each item was a testament to the fever's silent march, each envelope a fragment of a tragedy that bureaucracy could neither contain nor ignore. Elias Harrow entered, lantern still in hand, his coat dusted with soot and damp from the foggy alleys he had traversed. He moved past the rows of chairs, where officials sat stiff-backed and wary, eyes flicking nervously toward the evidence. He felt the weight of every observation he had made, every child he had cradled, every mother whose lips quivered with despair, pressing upon him like a living thing. A clerk approached with a long parchment, ink smudged from hurried hands. "Dr. Harrow," he said, voice low, "the board requests your testimony. They require confirmation that these samples, these notes, reflect the conditions of the city accurately." Elias nodded, setting down the lantern. "They do," he said firmly. "I have observed the fever, traced the water, documented the spread. Every vial, every report, every letter is a piece of the truth. The illness is not random nor confined. It moves with the water, through pipes, basins, and cisterns, reaching every home connected to the municipal supply." A councilman, distinguished by his carefully waxed moustache, leaned forward. "And you are certain, doctor, that the contamination arises from the municipal pumps, that the city's oversight has failed?" Elias met his gaze steadily. "I am certain," he said. "The evidence is here, sealed and verified. The vials show iron-laden water, sediment, traces of organic decay. The letters describe the progression of fever in children and adults alike. Even the laundress's reports confirm that clothing will not rinse clean. All of this points to a single, persistent source: the municipal water system." Murmurs rippled through the hall. The officials shuffled papers, glanced at each other with polite concern, but the underlying unease was palpable. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, curling through the city like a living, invisible hand. It carried the scent of iron, of illness, of the sweetness that had come to mark the fever's presence. One of the clerks, a young man with pale fingers, opened a sealed envelope and held it for the council to see. Inside was a note from a mother in Brindle Court. "My children drink from the pump, and they tremble. Their lips are sweet. I fear what I cannot see." The room fell silent. Elias stepped closer to the table where the evidence lay. "Observe the consistency," he said, lifting a vial to the lantern light. The water shimmered faintly, cloudy, bearing the sheen of contamination. The fever is deliberate in its spread, patient in its method, and relentless in its effect. If measures are not taken to isolate the pumps, flush the pipes, and cleanse the cisterns, more will fall. A senior councilwoman cleared her throat, glancing nervously at the documents. "And yet, action may incite panic. People will riot. The city's reputation, the commerce." Elias's hand pressed onto the edge of the table. "Panic cannot rival death. The city is already in peril. Every hour of delay allows the fever to claim more lives. The evidence before you is not theoretical. It is proof: lives lost, children collapsed, mothers fainted, laundresses rendered helpless." The candles flickered in sudden draught, casting long shadows over the sealed evidence. Each vial, each letter, each note seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, a reminder that the fever was patient, persistent, and unstoppable. Outside, the streets hummed with muted cries, coughing, fevered murmurs, footsteps of the living burdened by the invisible menace. The inquiry could debate, deliberate, and deliberate further, but beneath the cobblestones, through the pipes and basins, the fever waited, ready to claim the next victim. Elias exhaled slowly, pressing his hands to the table. The sealed evidence was undeniable. The city, however, was still hesitant, and the fever, patient as always, would not wait for hesitation. The lantern swung in Elias Harrow's hand, casting a trembling circle of light across the narrow alleys, puddled with rain and the pale sheen of iron-stained water. The fog pressed close, curling along walls and stairways, clinging to the uneven cobblestones like a living thing. Every footstep echoed with a hollow certainty, every cough from the tenements a reminder that the fever had spread far beyond its first whispered claims. The city slept fitfully, unaware that its lifeblood, the very water meant to sustain it, had become a conveyor of death. Mary Brindle walked beside him, shawl drawn tightly, eyes scanning each doorway, each window, each flicker of candlelight. The slums were alive tonight in ways that were no longer ordinary. Children shivering beneath rags that had been washed in the tainted water. Mothers clutching cups with the sweetness lingering. Fathers standing pale and rigid against walls, silent with exhaustion. Even the cats that prowled the alleys moved with tentative hesitation, noses twitching at the coppery tang that clung to the air. Elias paused before a small alley branching from the main thoroughfare. The smell was stronger here, not only iron, but the faint sweetness of fever, and beneath it, something older, more pervasive, as if the slum itself exhaled illness with deliberate intent. He knelt briefly, pressing the lantern light across a puddle pooled beneath a broken spout. The water shimmered faintly, oily in the lantern glow, bearing the unmistakable residue of contamination. He could see strands of sediment, tiny flecks of organic matter, proof that the illness had taken root, patient and relentless. A thin cry rose from a doorway. Elias straightened, moving closer. Inside, a mother knelt beside her daughter, wringing her hands, whispering prayers that seemed swallowed by the fog. The child's cheeks were flushed, lips tinged with the sweetness that had become the fever's signature. Her small body trembled beneath the threadbare blanket. Elias crouched, checking pulse and breath, noting the rapid, shallow rhythm that spoke of early delirium. "This water," he whispered to Mary, voice low, "carries it. Every cup, every basin rinsed in these streets. The illness travels silently, patiently. It is no longer confined to houses near the first pump. It spreads through every channel, every neglected cistern, every overlooked leak." Mary's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the child's shawl. "And the people?" she asked quietly. "How are they to survive when even the water itself betrays them?" Elias did not answer immediately. He lifted the lantern higher, letting the weak glow sweep across the alley, illuminating shuttered windows and the silhouettes of sleeping families. "They survive by vigilance and care," he said finally, "by avoiding the water wherever possible, by tending to the sick, by preserving whatever semblance of safety we can muster. But the fever is patient, and patience is its greatest weapon." A distant cough echoed along the alley, followed by a wheezing breath, thin and tremulous. The fog seemed to carry the sound directly to Elias, pressing against his ears, his chest, his very being. He adjusted the lantern, seeing movement in the shadows, a laundress moving cautiously between basins, a child stumbling in the dark, another mother carrying a pail that had once held safety, but now contained betrayal. "The slums themselves are infected," Mary whispered, eyes scanning the alley. "Not just the people. The walls, the floors, the basins, it all carries the fever." Elias nodded grimly. "And that is why I carry the lantern tonight, not only to see, but to guide, to mark the paths where illness has spread, to illuminate what others cannot perceive. Every step we take in these alleys is a fight against the unseen, against patience, against death itself." The fog thickened, curling around the lantern's light like a living veil. The sweet iron tang clung to their coats, their hair, their skin. Elias moved onward, careful, deliberate, lantern swinging. The slums waited, patient, silent, and unyielding. And he knew, with the certainty that pressed upon his chest like stone, that the fever would not pause for hesitation, nor for mercy, nor for the faint, flickering glow of a doctor's lantern in the mist. The pump stood crooked in the courtyard, a weary sentinel whose iron frame had been battered by weather and neglect, and now by unseen forces far more insidious. Its handle, once solid and obedient, had snapped in the middle, leaving a jagged edge that pointed skyward like a finger accusing the city itself. Mary Brindle approached cautiously, heart tightening as she observed the metal's unnatural tilt. Even inanimate objects seemed complicit in the fever's advance, and the broken handle was no exception, a mute herald of danger, waiting to be understood. Elias Harrow knelt beside the pump, lantern light quivering across the stonework. The base was slick with condensation, and a thin film of water, tinged with the signature sweetness and faint iron tang, pooled around it. He pressed his fingers lightly against the metal. The handle had not snapped from misuse, nor from ordinary corrosion. It had yielded under some invisible strain, as though the water it had drawn upward carried more than fluid. It carried fever, weight, and an unseen pressure that had finally manifested in tangible fracture. Mary's breath caught. "Do you think the water itself?" Elias shook his head slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the broken handle. "It is not conscious, not in the way we understand, but it is relentless. Every drop carries it. The illness spreads with the flow, infiltrating every basin, every household, every laundress's hand, until the pumps themselves bear the strain of what they deliver. This handle," he trailed off, pressing his palm flat against the jagged metal, "this handle has become a symbol. It shows what the water has endured and what we have failed to stop." A thin gust of wind stirred the fog, curling along the alley and pressing into their coats. The alleys of Brindle Court were quiet now, but the silence was heavy, loaded with the memory of coughs, fevered cries, and the subtle, cloying sweetness that lingered in every breath. The broken pump handle seemed to echo all of it, patient, relentless, and unyielding. Mary knelt beside the pool at the pump's base, dipping a cloth into the water. Even after wringing it out, the sheen clung to her fingers, a faint reminder that the illness was not yet spent. She looked at Elias, voice trembling. "How many more must fall before this is fixed?" Elias exhaled slowly, setting the lantern beside him. "We do what we can." Isolation of the pump, flushing the lines, cleansing the cisterns. But every hour of delay, every hesitation, allows the fever to move further. Each home touched, each cup drawn from this courtyard, brings the illness into more lives. The handle is broken, yes, but the disease has already flowed beyond it. A child's cough sounded from a nearby doorway, harsh and wet, and Mary flinched. Another cough answered it further down the alley, faint yet insistent. Elias looked toward the sound, noting the progression of illness with grim calculation. "The broken handle does not stop the fever," he said quietly. "It only marks it. Each fracture, each failure, each silent witness is a reminder that the city itself cannot endure in ignorance." Mary pressed her hand to the jagged metal, shivering despite her shawl. "And still, the people will drink from it tomorrow, just as they have today." Elias nodded. "They must be warned. The blueprint, the lantern, the measures we take, they are all attempts to slow what is already moving. But patience favors the illness. The water will continue. The fever will continue. And until the pumps are repaired, until the cisterns are cleansed, every handle, broken or whole, will bear the weight of death and the burden of what we cannot yet prevent." The fog thickened further, curling around the pump, wrapping the broken handle in a pale, unrelenting shroud. The alley seemed to lean closer, pressing in on them, carrying with it the distant, metallic sweetness that marked the presence of the fever. Elias and Mary stood silently, knowing that the broken pump handle was more than a failure of iron. It was a testament to the persistence of the illness, patient and inexorable, flowing onward through the veins of the city, claiming each new hour as it passed. The courtroom smelled of damp wood, candle wax, and the faint metallic tang that had become synonymous with the city's fever. The air pressed upon every attendee with a weight that matched the severity of the testimony about to be given. Outside, fog curled along the cobblestones, drifting past shuttered windows, carrying whispers of illness and faint cries from alleys where the fever had already claimed its victims. Inside, a hush fell, expectant and heavy, as Ada Merrin, the widow of a man claimed too soon by the poisoned water, rose to give her account. Mary Brindle stood nearby, shawl tight about her shoulders, eyes fixed on Ada. The widow's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the witness stand, her knuckles white, but her gaze was steady, unwavering in the face of the officials seated before her. Each face was pale, some sympathetic, others cautious, as though listening too closely might admit culpability for the city's suffering. I do not know how to begin," Ada whispered, voice soft, tremulous, yet carrying through the hall with a clarity that drew attention. "My husband, Samuel, drank from the pump in our courtyard, the one we have used for years. He told me nothing was wrong, that the water tasted sweet, harmless. But by evening, his skin burned with fever, his lips tinged with sweetness no child should know. By morning, he was gone." A collective shiver passed through the room. Officials exchanged glances, some scribbling notes, others leaning back as if to distance themselves from the weight of her words. The sweetness she described was no ordinary symptom, and yet she spoke of it plainly, without embellishment, as though it were a fact as undeniable as the pallor of Samuel's body when it had been carried from the tenement. "I brought him to Dr. Harrow," Ada continued, voice gaining strength. "I begged for help, but the illness moves faster than the hands of those meant to save. It does not wait for doctors, for law, for mercy. And the water, oh, the water. Every bucket, every basin, every cup carries it. It touched him. It touched others in our courtyard. And still, they drink from it, unaware." Mary's fingers tightened around her shawl. She had seen the fever's reach firsthand, the sweetness that clung to breath, the pallor, the trembling, the convulsions that stole life quietly, deliberately. Ada's testimony merely confirmed what she had known, but feared to speak aloud. A councilman leaned forward, clearing his throat. "And you claim the water caused your husband's death?" Ada's eyes, wide and unwavering, met his. "Yes. I watched him, helpless. I washed him in it. I gave it to our children. I carried it in every cup I handed to them. The water is poisoned. The city ignores it, and the illness spreads through every home it touches." Silence fell again, heavy and unbroken. Outside, the fog shifted, curling around the courthouse like a living entity, carrying the faint coppery tang that had become synonymous with death. Every cough from the street, every wheeze, every soft whimper seemed to answer Ada's words, as though the city itself bore witness to her account. Elias stepped forward, lantern dimmed but in hand, to lend corroboration. He recounted the inspection of pumps, the tests of water, the observations in households where children trembled and mothers wailed. Each detail, each note, each vial placed on the table added weight to Ada's testimony, evidence that could not be denied. Mary exhaled slowly, watching Ada turn her gaze from the officials to the floor. "They will listen now," she whispered, though even she knew that hearing was not the same as action. Ada's voice softened, almost a murmur. "I do not ask for revenge. I ask only for recognition, for the living to be spared what I could not spare him from, for the city to remember the sweetness that kills." Outside, the fog thickened further, pressing against the courthouse, curling around every stone, and the fever waited patiently, silently, indifferent to testimony, evidence, and grief, for the next unwary soul to draw a cup of water into their lips. The blueprint lay spread across the drafting table like a fragile promise, its edges curling slightly from the damp that had settled in the air. Lantern light trembled across the meticulously drawn lines, tracing every pipe, every cistern, every pump and hidden channel that carried water and death through the slums of Brindle Court, Hollow Bend, and beyond. Elias Harrow leaned over the parchment, eyes narrow, hand tracing the route of the tainted flow, as though by following it with his finger he might contain the fever itself. Mary Brindle stood behind him, shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, breath quiet and careful in the still room. She watched the lines converge, diverge, loop and twist through alleys, under homes, beneath warehouses and breweries. "Do you truly believe it can be done?" she asked softly, voice trembling with both hope and despair. "Can we cleanse it fast enough? The fever moves faster than any remedy we have brought." Elias exhaled slowly, tapping the edge of the parchment. "It is possible," he murmured. "Not easily, not without labor, patience, and sacrifice. But it can be done. We must isolate the pumps, flush the pipes, and cleanse the cisterns. Every step must be precise, every measure deliberate. The blueprint is not merely a map, it is a lifeline." The fog pressed against the windows, curling into the corners of the room, carrying with it the faint, metallic sweetness that marked the illness's presence. Beyond the walls, the slums hummed with quiet suffering, children shivering beneath blankets, mothers pacing with fevered infants, the faint echo of coughing and wheezing pressing against the city like an invisible tide. The blueprint, Elias knew, was only a plan. The execution would be an entirely different matter. He traced the path from the river intake to the largest cistern, then onward through the network of hidden pipes that had betrayed the city. Each node, each valve, each junction was annotated. Inspection, cleansing, temporary isolation, replacement, where decay had made repair impossible. Elias imagined volunteers descending into the alleys and basements, following the map as if it were a set of instructions for survival, moving with precision and urgency against an invisible enemy. Mary leaned closer, pointing to a section of the blueprint near Bramble Court. "And here?" she asked. "The pipes beneath the brewery. The contamination is deepest here. How do we reach it without making matters worse?" Elias pressed his finger against the line, tracing it slowly. "Carefully," he said. "We must excavate deliberately, shoring up the foundations, taking nothing for granted. A single rupture could release more of the fever into the streets than it already has. Every measure is both a safeguard and a risk." He straightened, eyes scanning the lantern-lit room. The fever is patient. It moves silently, through water, through contact, through negligence. The city has ignored it too long. But this blueprint, this plan, is our only chance to reclaim the water, to protect the living, to slow the tide before it rises further. Mary nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the task. "And if we fail?" she whispered. Elias's hand rested on the parchment. "If we fail, the fever will continue. It will claim more children, more mothers, more fathers. It will flow through every pipe, every basin, every cup of water drawn in ignorance. This blueprint is our line against it, precise, deliberate, and necessary." The fog thickened outside, curling around the tenements and creeping into the alleys. Lantern light trembled against the walls of the room, casting long, wavering shadows over the carefully drawn lines. Elias traced them one last time, inhaling slowly, aware that every movement, every measure, every decision that followed would shape the fate of the city itself. And in the quiet, patient darkness, the water continued to flow, carrying fever, sweetness, and death, unaware of the blueprint laid out above, awaiting hands willing to challenge it. The Thames lay swollen and dark beneath the morning fog, its surface curling with pale, ghostly foam that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The river, once a steady artery of commerce and life, now carried a sinister undertone, the subtle sweetness and metallic tang that heralded the spread of fever throughout the city. Along its banks, engineers and volunteers gathered, shovels and barrels at hand, lanterns casting trembling light across the slick cobblestones. The river purification trials had begun. Elias Harrow stood at the water's edge, lantern in one hand, a small vial of treated water in the other. His eyes traced the foam curling against the piers, following its path downstream where the slums waited. Every ripple, every current seemed deliberate, patient, as though the river itself conspired to distribute the poison more efficiently than any human could. He inhaled the faintly sweet, iron-laden air and grimaced. Even here, outside the basins and pumps, the signature of illness was unmistakable. Mary Brindle shivered beside him, holding a coarse cloth she had dampened in a nearby bucket. "Do you truly think these trials will succeed?" she asked softly. "The river is vast, and the illness, it moves faster than any remedy we can pour into its waters." Elias dipped the vial into the river, letting it fill with the dark, swirling liquid. When he lifted it, the contents shimmered faintly, suspended with tiny particles of sediment and the residue of fever. He swirled it gently. "It is the only chance we have," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of countless children and mothers whose lives had been touched, tainted, stolen. "The trials may slow the spread, may remove some of the contamination, may give the living a measure of safety, but the fever is patient, and these measures are temporary. The river will continue its work unless every channel, every pipe, every cistern is addressed in kind." A volunteer stepped forward, carrying a barrel filled with charcoal, sand, and powdered lime. The mixture was intended to filter and treat the water before it reached the city's pumps. He poured it into the river with careful hands, watching the foam curl and swirl as it interacted with the additives. But even as the particles sank and dispersed, the subtle sheen of contamination remained, stubborn and unyielding. Mary pressed her gloved fingers to her lips, tasting faintly the iron tang that lingered in the air. "It mocks us," she whispered. "We can pour and stir and strain, and yet the fever is already downstream, moving into homes we cannot reach." Elias nodded. "It is relentless," he said. "It does not hurry, yet it is faster than we can measure. The sweetness we taste, the pallor in children's cheeks, the trembling of those who touch water meant to sustain them, it is all evidence of its patient, deliberate reach." Downstream, a laundress brought a basin to the edge of the river, dipping it carefully into the currents. She had heard of the trials but could not wait. The fever had already touched her children. She filled her pail, ignoring the shimmer of contamination, because necessity outweighed caution. The water would carry the fever further, but she had little choice. Elias exhaled slowly, lowering the vial and looking upstream. The fog pressed against the river, curling into every pier and alleyway, carrying the faintly sweet, iron-laden tang into every crevice of the city. The trials would begin to filter, to purify, to intervene, but they were only a small defense against a fever that had learned patience, persistence, and cunning. Mary adjusted her shawl, eyes following the river's slow, inexorable flow. "It watches us," she said, "and it will not wait." Elias's gaze lingered on the foam drifting downstream. "No," he murmured. "It waits, patient, silent, and unrelenting. And until we can purify every source, every channel, every cistern, the city remains at its mercy." The lanterns flickered in the fog, reflecting faintly on the water, casting long, wavering shadows. And beneath the surface, the Thames continued to move, carrying fever, sweetness, and death indifferent to the trials above. The fever clinic stood in the shadow of the warehouses, a makeshift sanctuary amid the fog-drenched docks. Lanterns hung from rickety poles, their flickering light illuminating rows of cots that were already crowded with the sick. The scent of carbolic mingled with the faint, persistent sweetness of poisoned water, carrying a promise of fever, delirium, and despair. Children, pale and trembling, lay beneath threadbare blankets. Mothers knelt beside them, whispering prayers into ears that barely responded. Fathers leaned against walls, exhausted, helpless, and pale. Elias Harrow moved between the cots, lantern swinging in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each child he examined, each fevered body he touched, was a testament to the city's failure, to the silent spread of illness through pipes, basins, and cisterns. The sweetness lingered in the air, faint but insistent, marking the passage of the fever from one life to the next. He pressed his fingers to a small boy's wrist, noting the rapid pulse beneath clammy skin, and muttered quietly to himself, patient, relentless, unseen, yet everywhere. Mary Brindle followed closely, carrying a bundle of clean, boiled water in a tin pail. She moved with care, distributing it to mothers desperate to bathe their children or offer a sip that might sustain them. Even so, the metallic tang of the water clung to her gloves, a reminder that purity was fleeting and uncertain. She caught the eyes of a young mother, whose infant shivered beneath a soaked blanket. Mary knelt, pressing a cool cloth to the child's forehead, inhaling the iron-laced sweetness that clung faintly to the air. "It moves faster than we can follow," she whispered. The clinic was overcrowded, yet still more arrived. From the alleys and riverbanks, parents brought their fevered children, neighbors carried the weak and trembling, and even the occasional adult appeared, coughing, gasping, eyes glazed with the telltale pallor of the fever. Each arrival pressed the boundaries of the space, forcing cots together, leaving little room for the sick to breathe, for caregivers to move. A nurse, gaunt and weary, approached Elias with a bundle of linens. "The basins overflow again," she said softly. "Even boiled water cannot cleanse them fully. The foam, the sheen, it remains." Elias nodded grimly, eyes scanning the crowded ward. "It is patient," he said. "Every child, every parent, every basin touched by the water carries the fever further. And here, in this clinic, we can only delay its progress, not stop it entirely." Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, curling through the cracks and eaves, carrying faint echoes of coughing, cries, and the metallic sweet tang of the illness. The docks themselves seemed haunted, the water that lapped against the piers dark and reflective, swirling faintly with foam that glimmered like smoke under the lanterns. Every breath drawn outside carried the promise of contamination. Every touch of water, basin, or fabric was a conduit for the fever. Mary knelt beside a child whose tiny body trembled violently, holding the cloth against fevered skin. "We are only temporary guardians," she whispered, voice trembling. "We can tend, we can soothe, but we cannot shield them from the water entirely." Elias adjusted his lantern, watching the shadows stretch and twist along the walls. "This clinic is a bulwark," he said softly, "a fragile line against what moves beneath the city's streets, in its pumps, its cisterns, its very veins. Every breath we preserve here, every life we tend, is a small victory, though fleeting." The fog thickened outside, curling around the docks and the alleyways, pressing in on the lantern-lit clinic. And within, the fever waited, patient, relentless, and silent, creeping through every touch of water, every sigh, every whispered prayer. The clinic could delay its advance, care for the fevered, even offer moments of reprieve. But the city, patient, unyielding, unwashed, still belonged to the illness. The first glimmers of reconstruction glinted faintly in the morning mist, as though the city itself were attempting to reclaim its own breath. Brindle Court, Hollow Bend, and the alleys that had been thick with fog, illness, and despair now bore the faint outlines of scaffolding and brickwork, glimpses of effort striving against months of neglect and contamination. Gas lamps, newly polished and trimmed, flickered weakly against the damp morning, casting light across streets that had long languished in shadow. The slum was, at least in part, reborn. Mary Brindle walked along the uneven cobblestones, carrying a bundle of boiled water and folded blankets. Her eyes lingered on the newly laid bricks, stacked carefully along the facades of tenements, walls that had been repaired after the rot and seepage had been discovered. Every stone, every line of mortar represented a small victory, though it did little to erase the memory of fever, the sweetness that had clung to water, and the pallor of children's cheeks that would never recover fully. Elias Harrow followed closely, lantern in hand, inspecting every drain and pump along the way. He paused at a corner where a cistern had been cleaned and partially reconstructed. The water within it shimmered faintly, still carrying traces of iron and the subtle sweetness of contamination. But the repairs offered hope, however fragile, however tenuous. "It is a start," he said quietly, voice low, almost to himself. "But the city must continue this work, tirelessly, without pause." Workers moved steadily along the streets, replacing broken pipes, reinforcing foundations, and installing rudimentary filtration. They moved carefully, aware that even one misstep could release tainted water into streets and homes already suffering. Their hands were calloused, their clothes streaked with mud, and their faces etched with exhaustion, but determination pressed them onward. For the first time in weeks, the slums seemed to stir with something beyond fear, with cautious hope, fragile but tangible. Mary knelt beside a makeshift basin that had been repaired, dipping a cloth into the treated water and wringing it carefully. The sheen of contamination was faint here, diluted and diminished, though she could still taste the trace of iron as she pressed it against her palm. "It is not gone," she murmured. "Not entirely, but it is less deadly." A child ran past, small feet pattering across the damp cobblestones, laughing faintly as she chased a stray cat. Her laughter was tentative, fragile, but it carried across the alley, reaching ears that had long been deafened by coughs, cries, and the constant hum of fevered misery. Mary exhaled slowly, watching the girl dart between newly repaired walls, her shawl trailing behind her like a banner of fragile survival. Elias adjusted his lantern, eyes scanning the repaired pumps and newly installed channels. "The fever will not vanish overnight," he said. "It moves silently, patiently, waiting for neglect or error. But brick by brick, filter by filter, we push it back. We create safe spaces, however temporary, however imperfect. And that may be enough to preserve life, enough to offer the living a chance to endure." Mary pressed her hands together, feeling the cool moisture of the alley and the warmth of cautious progress. The slum was not clean, not safe, not free from memory. But the brickwork, the light, the careful reconstruction all signaled resilience. The fever still lurked, patient and unseen, yet humanity had begun to reclaim its hold. Outside, fog rolled through the streets, curling around walls and alleyways, mingling with the faint sweetness that lingered in the air. The slum had been scarred, hollowed by illness and neglect. Yet now, beneath scaffolding and flickering lamps, it stood poised to endure. Brick by brick, light by light, a slum was reborn, fragile but unbroken, while the fever, patient and relentless, waited in the shadows for the next misstep, the next lapse, the next careless drop. The report arrived on a grey morning, carried by a clerk whose hands trembled with the knowledge it contained. Its edges were damp from the fog that clung to the streets, and the ink on its pages bore the faint metallic tang of iron, a subtle reminder of the fever it chronicled. Elias Harrow held it carefully, as though the very act of touching the parchment might spread the illness that had so patient, so deliberate, claimed countless lives across the slums. Mary Brindle watched over his shoulder, eyes tracing the official script and the meticulous annotations. Each paragraph detailed the spread of fever through Brindle Court, Hollow Bend, and the alleyways beyond. Children were listed, their ages and symptoms recorded with clinical detachment, yet beneath the statistics lay a story of desperation, of mothers cradling trembling children, of laundresses overwhelmed by basins that would not rinse clean, of fathers powerless against the invisible tide that had flowed through every pipe and cistern in the city. Elias exhaled slowly. "It is undeniable," he murmured. "Every observation, every sample, every report from the wards and households confirms what we have seen with our own eyes. The water carried the fever, and the water continues to carry it. Nothing can deny that. Mary's fingers traced the words on the page, trembling slightly. "And they will act now?" she asked. "After everything? After the children, the mothers, the dead?" Elias shook his head. "Action will be slow. Bureaucracy, caution, fear of panic, they still weigh heavily on those in power. But this report cannot be ignored. It bears the names, the numbers, the evidence that cannot be questioned. It carries the truth in a way letters and whispers never could." Outside, the fog pressed against the windows of the council chamber, curling through the stonework, carrying the faint, cloying sweetness that had become synonymous with the illness. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for recognition, for intervention, for the slightest acknowledgement that the fever had spread unchecked, patient, relentless, indifferent. Elias turned the pages slowly, noting each instance of collapse, each household touched, each death recorded with solemn precision. The undertaker's overflowing yard, the laundress's water-stained hands, the children trembling in beds beneath blankets tainted by fever, all were chronicled in meticulous detail. The report was more than a document, it was a mirror held up to the city, reflecting its failures, its negligence, its vulnerability. Mary leaned closer. "They cannot ignore this," she said softly. "It shows everything, the spread, the cause, the consequences." Elias nodded, though his face remained grave. "They may not ignore it, but they will debate it. They will deliberate. And while they do, the fever continues to move through every home, every street, every alley. This report may shock them, yes, but the city has been patient, and the illness is even more so." A distant cough echoed faintly through the fog, followed by the scrape of a cart along wet cobblestones. Mary pressed her hand to her chest, the weight of countless lives pressing down upon her. "It is relentless," she whispered. Elias closed the report, laying it carefully on the table. Lantern light flickered across its surface, reflecting faintly on the inked words. "Yes," he said. "Relentless, patient, unyielding. And until every pump is cleansed, every pipe flushed, every cistern purged, the fever will continue to claim life quietly, invisibly, and inevitably." Outside, the fog deepened, curling along the docks, the alleyways, the rooftops. The river carried the faint sheen of foam downstream, and the city itself seemed to shiver under the weight of the truth now chronicled in ink and paper. The report had shaken the empire, at least on paper, but the fever, patient as always, waited beyond bureaucracy, beyond discussion, beyond the reach of human comprehension, ready to claim the next cup of water, the next breath, the next soul. The morning light was pale, diffused through the lingering fog, and it fell across the slums like a tentative promise. Brindle Court and Hollow Bend, streets that had been drenched in fear, sweat, and the metallic sweetness of poisoned water, now gleamed faintly under the early sun. Lanterns swung along scaffolds and repaired facades, casting trembling shadows that hinted at both ruin and renewal. The water, once dark, tainted, and patient in its silent march, ran clear for the first time in months. Mary Brindle stood beside a newly repaired pump, her shawl damp with fog and sweat, hands pressed to the cool iron handle. She turned it slowly, and the water that emerged was clean, sparkling faintly with clarity that seemed almost unnatural after weeks of the fever's lingering taint. She cupped it in her hands and lifted it to her lips, tasting the absence of sweetness, the absence of metallic tang, the absence of danger. Relief surged quietly through her chest, tempered by the memory of what had been lost. Elias Harrow knelt beside her, lantern at his feet, inspecting the newly flushed pipes and cisterns. He had overseen the careful excavation of hidden channels, the purification of every compromised reservoir. and the replacement of fractured pumps. His coat was streaked with mud and the residue of weeks of labor, yet his eyes held a glimmer of weary triumph. "It is finally contained," he murmured, voice low. "The water runs clean, for now, but we must remain vigilant." Patient as it was, the fever could return if neglect follows. Children gathered hesitantly around the courtyard, eyes wide at the clarity of the liquid. Mothers allowed them to drink, their expressions wary but hopeful. A father bent low, lifting a small basin to catch water for his family, inhaling the faintly sweet free air, as though tasting salvation itself. The alleyways seemed to breathe differently, less oppressive, less laden with the scent of iron and decay. For the first time in weeks, the slum felt like a place of life, rather than a conduit of death. Yet the memory of fever lingered in every corner. The laundry that had refused to rinse clean now shed its last traces of contamination. But Mary knew that each folded garment carried the echoes of illness, of sleepless nights, of parents cradling fevered children. Even the repaired walls and scaffolds, the newly polished lamps, and the clear water could not erase the imprint of suffering. The city had endured, yet it bore the scars of the invisible enemy it had weathered. Elias moved along the line of pumps, testing each one, listening for the hollow gulp that had once echoed like a warning through the streets. There was silence. The pipes had been purged, the cisterns cleansed, and for the first time in months, the water's patient, merciless voice was stilled. He exhaled slowly, resting his hands on the cool iron of the final pump. "The city has reclaimed a measure of safety," he said quietly, "but vigilance is our only assurance." Mary knelt beside a child, pressing a cool hand to a fevered brow. Relief spread in gentle waves, yet she did not allow herself to smile fully. The fever had been patient, relentless, and invisible. It had claimed lives quietly, deliberately, and she knew that even as the water ran clear, the memory of the illness would linger in every home, every street, every whisper of fear. Outside, the fog lifted slightly, revealing rooftops, alleys, and the dark, patient river. The city had endured, scarred but alive, and the water flowed clean for the first time in months, a fragile triumph over what had been invisible, relentless, and unyielding. And in that moment, the slums breathed collectively, cautiously, as though savoring a victory long overdue. The fever had been repelled, for now, but the city, patient and watchful, would never forget the silence that had once carried sweetness and death through every drop.